The Many Sons of Winter. Seek Demon. Summary. Discontinued pending major rewrite. The slumbering direwolf of the North has rested peacefully for nearly 300 years, content to rest and build as they always had since the days of King Torrhen Stark, who had surrendered his crown to Aegon the Conqueror in the name of peace and fealty. His heart broken by the loss of the kingdom passed down through the ages, his bastard brother takes him on a trek around the north to survey the realm he rules now as Lord Paramount, and in a blizzard, they find something that forever changes the history of not just the North, but the entire world. But nothing can sleep forever. When Prince Rhaegar Targaryen snatched Lyanna Stark from the city of Winterfell, the direwolf stirred from its slumber and was enraged by the death of its liege lord and his son and heir. The Andal realms of the south learned that the north was not the sparsely populated backwater they told their children about, but one of the foremost powers in Westeros. What if the north had a population on par with the Reach, brought about by having a reliable and consistent supply of food? First written for AlternateHistory.com. Chapter 1, Robb I. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Note. This story is discontinued until a major rewrite has been completed in the indeterminate future. It'll be back eventually, but as the story is currently not in a state that I myself am happy with, I'd suggest waiting until the new and improved version is finished. *********. The great city of Winterfell, 297 years after Aegon's conquest. Robb panted behind his visor, tightening his grip upon the dull iron greatsword as his brother, his half-brother, backed off, the scratch upon his breastplate catching the light like fresh fallen snow. The clang of steel on steel echoed all around him as dozens of his cousins drilled against one another under the watchful eye of the Master-at-Arms. He focused on the direwolf helm in front of him, even if he could see all the crests around him in the corner of his vision. There was at least one from almost every house in the north, sons that had been sent to the capital to be his father's wards, and to grow alongside him as though they were brothers. Just as they sent their daughters after Sansa had been born. Again shouted Rodrik from across the courtyard, a few dozen men of the garrison watching the fights with interest, and Wyler Daly, Aelys Karstark and all the beautiful women who were his sister's ladies-in-waiting, looking down from the crystal glass windows of the ladies' ballroom nestled against the high walls of the castle between their scepters' lessons. He lowered his sword towards the ground, taking a defensive stance. He knew better than to try and beat Jon into submission. The last time he tried to do that he had slipped past his side after a missed swing and his brother had slashed his heel to the bone, or at least, he would have, had it been with a real blade. His brother laughed, the sound booming from his helmet. "Going to wait for me, Stark? That's not very heroic." Robb laughed, he knew his brother's tricks very well. "That's not going to work, Jon." There was a crash across the huge courtyard as the small Janumber fell backwards against a weapon rack after one of his cousins, a snowstick from just south of the gift, dove into him with his heater shield and sent the giant tumbling backwards. Jon dove forward in a fast flurry, trying to dazzle him with the reflection of his weapon in the late morning sun. Robb swung hard and quick, stopping his brother's assault dead in his tracks as their swords clashed. They were evenly matched, almost the same height. Definitely the same weight inside their suits of plate, and that made their sessions all the better. "You need to do better than that, Snow," he said with a hidden smile as he shoved his body forward and sent his brother reeling. He swung diagonally across his brother's breastplate, but he fell backwards, onto one knee, so Robb met him again, swinging downwards, towards the ground and towards his defenseless opponent. "When we're sparring, we have to stop being brothers, if only for a little while." Jon looked straight up to him, quickly raising his blade, halting Robb's chop before throwing himself up from the ground and turning around the flow of their fight, locking their blades against one another again, but he saw his brother slid his claw-like gauntlet down to his pommel. Quickly, Jon wrenched his blade around, putting all his strength on the pommel, his sword spinning around Robb's own in a quick, smooth motion, leaving him defenseless as he watched the pommel glide through the air towards him. Seven hells! There was a deafening bang that turned to ringing and a horrible, teeth-rattling shake as the iron pommel smashed into his helmet. His sword slipped from his grip as the left side of his face turned to pain. But above all, he felt the force of his brother, who had slipped round him in his painful confusion, throw his sword over his arms and against his gorget, a position that left him no choice but to submit. Yield, he said with a sigh, removing his direwolf helm as a young boy, a ward, ran onto the field and dragged the great sword away. John laughed in his victory, removing his helm and revealing his triumphant grin. Looks like it worked to me. The two walked off the field, Rob rubbing his cheek. Where'd you learn that, anyway? Arthur Dane used it against. Suddenly, they both heard the sound of harp music coming from amongst the tall, strong square towers of Winterfell. The castle had been built by Brandon the Builder in the Age of Heroes millennia ago, but it had grown since, built wider and higher. The monstrous keep towered high, casting a long shadow across the lands, as much a symbol of the power of the Starks as their crest. Every tower jutted into the sky, standing tall with pride, not a single one left to fall into ruin. Protective wards of the first men had been chiseled into the stones and built into the walls, promising to never let the castle fall. The castle was as large as Highgarden in the south, though he was sure the Southrons preferred to think of the castle as being perhaps a quarter of its actual size, just as they liked to pretend that the north had no cities. Looking towards the source of the music, he saw Domeric Bolton strumming his harp with masterful precision as he sat upon his wide windowsill, playing music for his love of the music, the flayed man of his house embroidered onto his fine clothes. The Boltons had once been the Starks' fiercest enemies long ago, but now, they were one of their strongest vassals, with a small city of their own outside the walls of the dread fort. Their words had once been feared, but now they were innocent and well-meaning, nodding towards the fact that they made the finest leatherwork in the north, if not the entire Seven Kingdoms. Everyone knew that it wouldn't be long before he and his sister were wed. Lord Bolton had suggested the match once before, but Ned had decided to let Sansa make her own choice when she came of age, even if her choice was already clear. He's at it again. Is there anything he loves more than that bloody harp? Asked Torrhen Karstark, his sword held over his shoulder and his brother Eddard right beside him. His hair, Rob answered, to everyone's laughter. Slowly, his pack, his kin, wandered over. They were from all the Stark cadet branches, the Snowsticks from the far north, where their keep sat amongst the snowy lands just beneath the New Gift, watching over the furthest pastures and the last true market town. They were big, strong men, from years of marrying with the Umbers and the clans. The Swamp Starks were the opposite, coming from Moat Cailin and were small, but quick on their feet, natural trackers and huntsmen. From the southeast came the Greystarks, the surviving branch that was forever repentant for the treasonous act that lost them the lands that eventually became White Harbor and ensured they would never become as great as any of the other branches. They were hungry for the chance to redeem themselves in the eyes of their fellow Northmen, so they were the first into battle and the last in retreat, always quick to volunteer even in the face of the grimmest odds. On the east coast there were the Seastarks, who preferred the open sea to the land and patrolled the northeastern coast alongside the Mandaelis, ensuring that lucrative trade routes to Essos were always open. Together, along with the Darkstarks on the coast of the Sunset Sea, they gave the North a fleet, just as they had thousands of years ago in the days of Brandon the Shipwright. And those were just the greater cadet branches. No keep in the north is more than a week's travel away from a Stark. Jon's going to have a town of his own soon. He'll be my bannerman and we'll fight the king beyond the wall together, just like in the stories. Their father had already promised Jon his own holding when he was old enough and a marriage too, so it was only a matter of time. Catelyn had been horrified when she found out, even more so than when she found that most of Rob's bannermen were Stark cadet branches descended from bastards and second sons. She thought they would commit treason, try and press a claim on Winterfell whenever Rob needed them most. She's wrong, they're my pack, my brothers, just as Bran and Rickon are. Sansa walked out of Winterfell's ballroom, blushing as red as a rose and smiling, trailed by her ladies-in-waiting who were her constant companions, just as he had his. Aelys Karstark smiled at him and he couldn't help but smile back. Torrhen and Eddard burst into laughter. What? He asked angrily as Jon watched. That smile, explained Eddard between laughs. What's funny? Asked a voice he knew all too well. Theon. The Greyjoy shoved past Jon, who glared at him angrily. Jon and Theon never got along, not from the first moment they met years ago when Theon had been brought back to Winterfell after his father rebelled. Theon had thought he could walk over Jon, calling him a bastard, insulting him whenever he could, but Jon had lashed back at him each and every time, saying he would rather be a bastard son of Winterfell than the true-born heir to the Iron Islands. Theon stank of wine and ale from the city's taverns, where he usually drank himself into a stupor, so much so that he had to be dragged back to the castle by the city watch lest he end up getting gutted like the squid he was. "Why do you care, squid?" spat Torren with disgust. They all knew how Theon liked to pick fights with Jon, and he was a member of the pack. "We look after our own, no matter what." Theon looked at them all, as arrogant as he always was, till he realized he was encircled on all sides by other Starks who had wandered over, a show of force as much as it was simple curiosity. He tried to back away, only for Donal Snowstock, only a year older than Robb yet a foot taller and as hard as a ram, placed a gauntlet hand upon his shoulder from behind. "Where are you going, Theon?" Robb asked coldly, stepping close. They had done this before, taught the Greyjoy a lesson that to start a fight with one of them was to start a fight with all of them. "I only wanted to know what was funny, that's all," Theon answered timidly. "You shoved Jon out of the way, you've done it before, too." Theon looked at Jon, and Robb almost felt sorry for the lone Greyjoy, who would never know the brotherhood that Robb felt with those around him. He looked towards Donal and nodded. The large man let him go, shoving him away, but leaving him unharmed, and only because Robb wanted it. "Don't do it again." Theon walked off, but he looked back to Robb for a moment before continuing on his way, out of the castle and into the city. In another world, perhaps they could have been like brothers, all of them together as one large, happy pack, but he doubted it. "If he stops trying to pick fights with Jon, then I might try and make a wolf out of him." "Gods, Robb, when did you get so grim?" asked Jon with a smile, relieving the tension in the air as he always could. They all laughed before heading inside, swapping steel plate for clothes before moving on to the next lesson of the day, before Maester Luwin could find them, or any of their other multitude of tutors for that matter. They did their practice in the lists and in the courtyard, true, learning how to use a lance and a sword, but that was only the beginning. Heading through Winterfell's great hallways, surrounded by statues of ancient Starks, direwolves standing dutifully at their sides, he led his own pack, his wolves of Winterfell, to the great war room where Theon the Hungry Wolf had planned his conquests thousands of years before. It was a large room, filled with detailed maps of every part of the Seven Kingdoms, and in the midst a large wooden table, carved to be an exact replica of the North, so old and ancient that it still showed the borders of the Red Kings engraved into its surface, though there had been countless additions since then, the most important being the canal that stretched from side to side of the North. Bookcases covered the walls, with tomes about 100 different ways of waging war and the designs for siege engines, ancient tactics and warrior tales. And there, in front of it with his arms crossed and his silver hair long, was a man he didn't recognize, looking back at them all with inquisitive violet eyes and very well dressed in orange and black. On top of his fine clothes was a golden chain, but the most spectacular part of it was the tiger crest dangling from the center, carved from shining topaz. He spoke with an accent Robb couldn't even begin to place. "You're late." "Who are you?" he asked in confusion. "Where's Rodrik?" The man looked at all of them, placing his hands behind his back. Then he spoke with certainty and pride. "I see your lord father never told you of the arrangement. Very well. I am free citizen Horono Veneris of Volantis. I am of the Tiger faction and you may address me as citizen Veneris. Your father believes you have learned enough of the West AOC way of war, and that you should learn the true manner of grand strategy and the tactics that maintained the Valyrian freehold and preserve its final ember today. Is he mad?" Robb began to speak. "We don't have dragons." "Dragons? Dragons?" Veneris laughed. "Dragons were powerful, yes, but you cannot hold territory with a dragon. You cannot forage for supplies with a dragon, you cannot garrison a city with them. The freehold was built with dragons, not kept with them. A dragon can be slain with a bolt from a scorpion to the neck, but the will of a people to wage war, can't. Do you truly believe that the Valyrians destroyed the Giscleri Empire without taking defeats?" He didn't wait for an answer. "No. They didn't. They were defeated many times upon the battlefield. Riders killed, dragons slain, armies destroyed. Giscleri legions were invincible on the battlefield." "Then, how did they win?" asked Jon, staring at the Volanten in confusion. "They won, by destroying the Giscleri legion. Not the armies, but the concept, the creation. The Giscleri legion was a complex thing. Soldiers, each serving for 3 years under arms, officers staying on for longer. Free men, not slaves, well armed, well trained, well equipped, gathered from around the empire and from all walks of life, supported by well-engineered siege weapons. A culture of soldiers, trained to fight as a group and not as warriors in single combat, not like the other peoples of the world at the time, they were a. Rob spoke instinctively. A pack. Citizen Horono Veneris smiled. Exactly. They fought as a unit, never breaking in search of individual glory. They knew their strength came from functioning as a whole, like bricks in a wall. But bricks are held together by mortar, so that is what the Freehold attacked. They attacked the cohesion, the brotherhood, that held together the legion. There are 2 weapons in the armory of a leader. Shock, and awe. Roderick taught you the former, I shall teach you the latter. He reached beneath the table and pulled out a map, not caring what it was meant to be of. Then he started placing forces. Awe is an attack against the enemy's spirits. The selective and instantaneous decapitation of the enemy army through the perception of our own invincibility, and the belief of their own weakness. All of his brothers stared at the man in a mixture of awe and confusion, but Rob stepped forward eagerly, looking at the map and taking in every word. You're talking about a farce, a trick. Making the enemy think they are weaker than they really are. The tiger started to grin. Correct again. A general who has won every battle he has been in before can often win every battle he goes into, simply because his reputation destroys enemy morale and makes them believe they will be defeated. It doesn't matter what the reality is, what matters is the perception of what is, and that can be an illusion. Once, there was a Volunteer tiger who had 500 men and made a town with twice his numbers defenders surrender, simply with that understanding. Besides the city, there was a thick forest. During the night he sent 400 men into the forest and all his horse far away, leaving only a small number of men to go about their business in the camp as usual. When the sun rose, his cavalry returned, looking like the vanguard of a reinforcing army while the 400 men in the forest staggered their movement and walked past the gatehouse. In the forests, it couldn't be seen, so when they walked out, he fell quiet, letting Rob realize. It looked like there were more than there really were. Exactly. He marched his men past the gates to show how many there were, spaced wide enough from one another that they could walk around the entire castle and never lose sight of one another as they marched around the walls, counting on the defenders' fear of an army that did not exist. So he rode up to the walls and demanded them to surrender, saying he had 2,000 men now and another 10,000 on the way, warning that if they did not surrender, he would burn the town and sell everyone into slavery. They threw open the gates and threw down their arms without a man being so much as drawing their sword. This is where the real power of dragons lies. They can kill men, certainly, they can destroy castles, of course, but they are a weapon of war, they can be seen across the battlefield with ease, their presence is noticeable and they leave a lasting legacy in the minds of people. Think very carefully. The Targaryens burned Harrenhal, yes, and that means they made an example of it. The greatest castle ever raised. Everyone would hear of it. Rob said, grasping the concept. It would make people think of how their own castles could be burnt and make them think their dragons were unstoppable. Aegon the Conqueror, he wanted Harren to fight him. Any dragon can be killed, but their reputation cannot. That is how Valyria defeated the Giscleri Legion. They attacked the veteran soldiers who inspired the men around them first, those who kept order. Then they would withdraw. Attack, retreat. Attack, retreat. The same army, coming from different directions each time, different portions of the army doing the attack, different dragons if they had them. Making the enemy believe there were more enemies in the area than there really were, with no around with enough experience to see through the deception, all while they were being pecked at, a piece at a time. Then they started having their scouts killed, their foraging parties wiped out, supplies grew short, and the Legion turned against itself. All we had to do, was sit and watch and allow the world's most powerful army destroy itself. All while, our own power was growing as the Freehold crept forward, hatching new dragons, raising new armies to the point they could match the fractured legions, taking the resources of the conquered lands of Essos and using them. But the Giscleri Empire, cracks were beginning to form. Their leaders were arguing over the little they had, competing for reinforcements and arguing over how best to fight us. The pack was tearing itself apart. It was a war of frustration, not of glorious, heroic conquest, slow and long, but it was to our strength and their weakness. The legions were not used to long, hard campaigns, and soon, a power struggle started in the empire. By the time it ended, there was no longer an empire to claim. Our forces had reached the capital, their legions burned beneath the shadows of our wings. The Giscari Empire had been the greatest power in the world at that time, and they were brought down by a freehold no bigger than any of the free cities. Deception, young lord, is but one of the three great parts of warfare. The second is maneuver, the third is force. Learn to control and use all three, and you shall never know defeat. The Ironborn knew how to make use of maneuver. Their ships let them ignore the worst terrain and isolate enemy strongholds, and they knew how to make use of force to crush their foes on the battlefield, but they did not know the value of knowledge, of learning about one's enemies, and so they were ultimately defeated. The wildlings know of deception and mobility but not force, so they will never truly defeat the Night's Watch or the North. The Dothraki are mobility and force also. Like the Ironborn, they are like a fire. Powerful, furious, but ultimately short-lived. But Egon the Conqueror, he knew of the power that was in knowledge and understanding, deception and trickery, mobility and overwhelming power. He spent years planning his conquest of Westeros, and so he had already won from the moment he first stepped ashore. So, let us begin, he said with clear enthusiasm. He went to his pieces and started shuffling his forces extremely quickly, knowing exactly how he wanted them deployed. The wolves gathered around as Robb carefully examined the free citizens' forces. He had created a mess. His infantry were arranged as if by a madman, his flanks were curved wide and thin, even his cavalry were in a position where they would never get enough momentum for a decisive charge. Everything was almost the opposite of what Rodrik had taught him and what his own instincts told him. But he shook off the confusion and carefully arranged his own army, the Volunten not moving once as he took in every exact detail. Then the battle began. And somehow, in what looked like only a few blinks of an eye, everything was coming apart at the seams. He had used his wide flanks to envelop Robb's army, his disorganized infantry in the melee seeming to be exactly where they needed to be at the exact moments they were needed, all while his cavalry simply sat back, unused except for those scarce few moments where Robb managed to nearly break out. Deception and knowledge is the foundation upon which all warfare is based. He reached over the pieces and knocked over the stark banner that represented Robb's lord, showing he had been slain in battle. Then he took up another map, a map of Westeros, setting the pieces again in a rough recreation of Robert's rebellion. The North had been content to simply sleep through the conflicts of the South or send them token forces of a few thousand men as they had in the Dance and the Blackfyre rebellions, with most Southrons thinking that the North was far weaker than it really was. But Rhaegar had woken the North and Aes had enraged it, so the armies of the North poured forth, 70,000 men eager for vengeance with another 30,000 guarding the homeland from any threat, whether they were wildlings or Ironborn. The Lannisters have gold, the Martells have deserts and the Greyjoys have ships, but we have men. How do you know all of this? I was born in the Orange and grew up surrounded by tigers, taught from my youth in the Valyrian ways of warfare and combat, but I was hungry for more knowledge, reading as many tomes as I could find about leading men into battle. One day, my searches led me to an old man, an exile from Yeti who had decided to spend the rest of his days traveling. He had been a commander of men so great he was worthy of legend, but he had fallen out of favor with his masters when he tried to take the throne for himself, only being spared because of his past victories. He had spent the last of his wealth and could barely speak the common tongue, so in exchange for a place to stay, I asked him to teach me whatever he could. We taught each other, truly, but he made me realize the true value of deception and simply making your enemy uncertain of your goals. A few years later, he received a pardon after a new faction came to power, so he returned home after thanking me. I never heard from him again, but his lessons have stayed with me. He gestured to the map with an empty hand, Robb finally noticing his pack had left for whatever reason. And I'm going to teach you, just as he taught me. Tactics is one animal but strategy and diplomacy are another. We will look through the history of the Seven Kingdoms, of Essos and of the Valyrian Freehold. He looked Robb straight in the eye. And do not worry about dishonor. Sometimes you must do dishonorable things now to complete greater honors tomorrow, and there is no greater honor than to win without killing. Asterisk 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 asterisk. End of part 1. Notes. Jon Snow, in this story, has never had to grow up with the stigma of being a bastard. Oh, sure, he is still a Snow, but he has known since he was very little that he would eventually be landed as the population of the North increases and new settlements continue to pop up. He's thus more confident, less grim, even a little playful, but the same honorable Jon beneath it all. Catelyn hasn't been able to treat him as bad as she did in canon, since whenever she complained Eddard could simply point to the various Stark cadet branches, most of which are descended either from second sons or bastards. Robb Stark is different too, having grown up around a lot of future Northern heirs, not to mention ladies. They are not hostages, the houses of the North sent them willingly so that they could grow alongside other Northern houses, which is naturally good for diplomacy. It also helps with matchmaking, but most important is that Robb Stark is friends with them. They know that one day Robb will be the Lord of Winterfell. He will be the only person who can grant town or city charters, which are, beyond important, /I. Without a charter, a town cannot legally create a marketplace, or set its own tax rates or create their own watch. Hell, they can't even put crenels on their walls without their charter giving them permission. A good charter could mean that a city gets tax breaks on certain goods or professions, reduced tariffs and tolls, even self-governance through a city council in some cases, though even then, they would be subservient to the Lord. But a bad charter would be the reverse and could utterly destroy a settlement's commerce, if not outright downgrade it from city to market town. Winterfell, as a castle, is larger than it is in canon, but it's still no Casterly Rock or Harrenhal, that's for sure. It has a larger garrison, a much larger keep, and not a single part of it has been allowed to fall into ruin. It has strong oaken rafters, walls high and thick, towers crowned with catapults and several barbicans watching the approaches and ensuring that the beating heart of the North will stay that way. I'll be covering more about the state of the North in later parts. For now, I'm going to be establishing the changes to the Stark family in this scenario. So, the next parts will be, in order, Jon, Sansa, Bran, Arya, Catelyn and lastly, Eddard himself. Then we'll have Robert, because this part takes place the day before the start of the book's laughing smiley. Anyway, on with the summary of this part. Robb Stark meets Sansa. Tongue-poking smiley. But seriously now, Robb Stark is being taught by a Volantene general, who is teaching him the value of grand strategy and large-scale diplomacy and intrigue, not just tactics. Eddard hired him to give his son a different perspective on warfare, maybe an insight to the way the Essozi fight in case they ever went to war with one of the Free Cities. But the Free Citizen is doing much more than he had been hired for. Tongue-poking smiley. And of course, Robb Stark is more flexible in this area than he was in canon simply because of the state of the North and how he will have to carefully maintain the balance of power in the North in his own right, as well as understand the full implications of his actions. Of course, he's obviously not going to be doing a red wedding of his own anytime soon, but if this was the Robb Stark of canon, he certainly wouldn't have married Jane Westerling, as he would know that he should choose the lesser dishonor, deflowering a noble woman, over the great dishonor, breaking his betrothal to a Free. He's just more flexible, more aware of reality. And we see a few of the branches of the Stark family. The North, as we know in canon, is mostly empty, or small settlements that answer to absolutely no one. That's not so much the case in this timeline, since the holdings of the Lords are actually smaller than they are in canon, but much greater in wealth and population. Even now, centuries after the pod, there are still vast stretches of land that are easiest to describe as lacking official claims. Most of the northern houses own 1 or 2 castles, maybe 3 if they are particularly powerful, but they'll be spread amongst the dynasty. There's still competition over the most valuable parts of the North, but that is less over natural resources and more over valuable trade routes. The real competition is for the favor of the Starks to get them to give privileges. Anyhow, there are several cadet branches of House Stark scattered throughout the North, some of them more successful than others. The Karstarks are still the strongest house to be descended from the Starks, however. And of course, Theon loses out. As in canon, he and Jon don't get along, but Robb and his friends have Jon's back. So, he spends most of his time drinking and whoring rather than getting up to no good with Robb. Tongue-poking smiley. Chapter 2, Jon I. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. *********. John looked at himself in the mirror, looking at the blue and gold direwolf crest embroidered upon his breast. He was a bastard, true, but he was a bastard of Winterfell, future lord of some part of the north. He had already had a few marriage proposals from lesser houses and masterly ones, but most of them were waiting to see what he would be given, first. He could be granted a new market town on the western coast, or a simple keep in the Wolf's Wood. He had to figure out words of his own, and of course, the colors of his new house once it was founded. Winterfell was a city, a great city at that, so there was never a lack of tailors who knew the different crests and colors of those houses that traced their lines back to the Starks. It was the hardest part of his life as a bastard. Figuring out what colors, and words, and crest. Gods be good, how am I supposed to do it? The blue and gold looked good, but he had the distinct feeling he had seen it somewhere else before. During a feast, he sighed. This won't do. I think I've seen another house with these colors. The tailor paused, looking over him from head to heel as he thought. He was being paid very well for this, John was making certain of it. He had a fondness for fine clothes, as Theon did, but this was far more important than just having a fine doublet. It was the creation of a family of his own, and he would spare no expense. Then he helped John take off the doublet and picked up another, the exact same shape and size, simply a different color for the crest, the trim and the cloth. Red and gold. John laughed at the sight of himself in the mirror. I'm a Stark, not a Lannister. The tailor chuckled to himself, then took that doublet away. While Robb had battled with his new mentor, he and the rest of the pack had left to go about their day. For Donal, that was getting his axe mended after snapping the pole during practice. For the Karstark brothers, that meant teasing their sister. The tailor stepped over again, with another doublet of a purple direwolf head on white. Dane, he asked, looking at himself in the mirror as the tailor adjusted the fit till it was just right. Aye, for the rumors of your mother, nodded the tailor, looking for a matching cloak. This would be much easier. Had you any idea what land you were getting? Even I don't know that, or who my mother was. Best to avoid the Dane colors, till we know for sure. The thought of who his mother was had crossed his mind a dozen times, but each time he asked his father he had promised to tell him when he was older, when he was 16 and truly a man grown in his own right. The entire North wondered who the Honorable Eddard Stark had put a child in during the war. Was it a highborn lady? A whore? Just some girl he had fucked one night? He didn't let it bother him. Eddard had promised to tell him when he was older, and it was more of a curiosity than anything important anyway. He would always be Eddard's son and Robb's brother, regardless of who his mother was. The tailor sighed. Why not, black on red, or purple on gold? The Dark Starks are orange on black, so it shouldn't be too hard to tell us apart. Black on red, let's see. The tailor rummaged through a pile of 12 doublets, all of them tailored to John's size, every single one a different set of colors. Then there were cloaks to go with them, breeches, boots, gloves and hats, which he never wore, but it helped to keep the styling consistent. The tailor smiled, then walked over with a black on red doublet. It was as soft and as high quality as all the others, and after fastening it up and looking at himself in the mirror, he liked it more than all the others combined. This'll do, he said with a smile. He quickly changed out his normal clothes for the black and red ones. Then he headed outside, into the bright light of day, and saw snowflakes coming down, the beginning of a summer's snow falling down upon the city. The cobblestone streets were busy, packed with crowds going about their day in peace, carts rolling past drawn by men, bright orange northern cows and the occasional horse, ferrying goods to and from market. Looking over the marketplace was a wood tree, a contemplative face carved into its surface, ensuring that every deal that took place in the market was seen by the old gods. If that was not enough to deter a thief, then the golden eagles that soared through the sky above were. The city watch had the service of a dozen wargs, and what better way to patrol the city streets than from the sky, where one man could watch thousands. Statues of ancient heroes as far back as Brandon the Builder watched over the people just as they had in life, though their bodies were entombed beneath the castle. He walked through the busy marketplace, looking around and never losing his smile. The smell of freshly baked bread and pastries wafted from a well-built baker's shop, besides which was a large, proud tavern that served the best ale in the city. He saw a young boy, covered in dirty leathers with the same stark hair and eyes, walk towards the bakery. He looked at an apple pastry inside, then he started rummaging through his coin purse, only to sigh in disappointment after counting his coins. John walked over and took out a silver. "Here," he said. The boy looked at him in shock, but he couldn't help but notice that the boy looked familiar. "Very so. Thank you." "No. She couldn't have made it out the castle this time." The boy quickly turned and started to walk inside. "Arya." The boy froze dead in her tracks. "My name's Ari. Ari the peasant boy." He laughed. "And what will Ned think if he finds out you've ran off again, Ari?" She sighed. "Don't tell father, please. He must her hair." "Why would I tell father? You've been by me the entire time." She looked at him in confusion for a moment, then caught on with a smile. Arya was outside the castle more often than she was inside it, a Septa's worst nightmare made real. She had no interest in being like a lady, certainly not, even Ned could barely keep her reined in, and he was usually unwilling to try, since she resembled her aunt all too much in how she acted and how she looked. The City Watch knew to keep an eye out for her, but Arya had only grown more experienced and more determined in slipping out of the castle to escape Septa Mordane. I wouldn't have recognized her if she had enough money. She knew how to blend in with the crowds, how to disappear whenever she wanted to, and sometimes by accident. Before, when she was little, she had completely vanished inside Winterfell, only to be found asleep in the rafters of the Great Hall itself. They had searched high and low, throughout the entire city, but they had never noticed her till she started to snore in her sleep. She didn't even know how she got up there when they got her down. But she's helping the Watch find any weaknesses in the castle, and in the city, too. She looked at his clothes. "Have you finally chosen your colors?" "I think so," he answered with his usual smile. "There isn't another house in the north with them." "Does that mean you're getting your land? You're leaving?" Arya was as close to John as Robb was, even coming with the wolves sometimes, even though it made Catelyn try all the harder to keep her daughter inside the castle. An uphill battle. She tried to tempt her with nice things, but Arya wasn't interested in soft dresses, beautiful jewelry or anything like that. She liked to explore like her brother Bran, she liked to wear leathers instead of dresses and would rather make a bow sing than a harp, but she was gradually starting to tame the wild girl, and then Eddard got Arya a full set of leather clothes, perfectly fitting to her and hard-wearing, well suited for traveling through the city and made from Bolton leather. After that, Catelyn had mostly given up on trying to make her into as gentle a lady as her sister Sansa, who, again, was certainly northern in how she liked to wear fur coats. He laughed. "Not yet. Not for a couple of years, anyway. Come on, we best get back to the castle before your mother gets too worried." Arya sighed and passed his back his silver, but followed as they returned to the castle, through the wide streets and gardens. The city had been built wide, with even the smallest buildings in the city being large when compared to the cities of the south. Space was no obstacle, so the city had 5 godswoods inside the walls, places where the old gods still ruled supreme and their worshippers frequented. There were a few shrines to the new gods around, a few small septs, but the largest was within the walls of Winterfell, built for his wife by Lord Stark so that she had a place to pray suitable for her station. But even her daughter Sansa had to be asked to go there, keeping the gods of her friends and ladies in waiting instead of the 7. As soon as he entered the castle, he heard Daisy shout out, not to him but to Arya, the she-bear standing tall in leathers of the same styling as Arya's, moving so smoothly that she might as well have been born with them. "Your mother has been looking everywhere for you." John turned red ever so slightly as the Mormont woman looked at him. Daisy had been his first love, even though she was 5 years older than him. He had been infatuated with her, so much so that he had proudly strode across the courtyard in broad daylight and confidently proclaimed his everlasting love and admiration for her, in front of all the wolves of Winterfell, in fact, in front of nearly the entire guard, who had been drilling in the courtyard. What was I even thinking? Robb had stared at him with his jaw agape at how bold he was, only for them all to burst into laughter when he was turned down, since he was little more than a child at the time and Daisy hadn't even the first idea that he was in love with her before then. He gave Ed Karstark a black eye and retreated to his chambers to be alone. Then later that night the wolves of Winterfell pinched a cask of ale from the buttery and helped him drink his sorrows away, even Ed and Tot. They still teased him for it, every now and then. For good reason. "Any news from Bear Island?" he asked, trying to break through the awkwardness. She smiled and said eagerly, "Jorah has another son, Jorah Mormont. That's his fourth, isn't it?" Many northern lords weren't expecting much of Jorah's marriage to Lioness Hightower. She was as southern as one could get, a pampered lady as fragile as glass who'd only give Jorah 2 children before she died. But that was her fourth birth, a daughter and 3 sons, now, and she had never lost a child. Everyone knew she had expensive tastes, but the Lord Mormont had turned the shipyards of Bear Island to make ships for sale to the other kingdoms and to merchants to make up for the expense. He's not making ships for the navy, but if I loved a woman as much as he loves his wife, I would do the same to make her happy. It is. She laughed. Gia, Brandon, Rhea and now Little Drold, and the Lannisters offered to buy Longclaw. A mountain of gold for it. Then she sighed, but smiled with relief. He never even thought of it, thankfully. If I had a Valyrian steel sword, no one would be able to get it out of my hands. Daisy looked at his clothes before asking with a teasing smile, "Is this the 6th Blackfyre rebellion?" "What?" He looked down at himself, at his red doublet with black stitching and the black direwolf above his heart. Black and red, black on red. 7 hells. That damn tailor never said. He spun on his heels and walked across courtyard towards the keep, Daisy laughing as he tried to draw as little attention to himself as possible. Catelyn disliked him as a bastard, true, but to have the colors of a man who tried to steal his brother's throne, a bastard who started a line of pretenders. She'll kill me if she sees me wearing this. Jon. He sighed as the Kraken walked over grinning. What is it, Theon? Jon Blackfyre. Theon laughed. Has Lord Stark given you ice? He had dreamt of it, once, of Ned giving him ice to wield, to carry into battle as his own blade. He knew it would never happen, it was not his weapon to carry. It belonged to the Starks of Winterfell, not to any of their cadet branches, like the crown of the Kings of Winter had. Though he might never wield the weapon, he had a something just as special, a gift from father to son. A bastard sword for the bastard son, with the same design of crossguard and pommel, the same patterned grip, only smaller. He had been given it on his 13th name day and to him, it was worth more than 1,000 Valyrian steel swords combined. No. Shame. The Greyjoy gave him a sly grin he already knew to hate. That'll be your brother's, and Winterf. Not this again. I don't have time for this. But I have brothers. You don't. Theon laughed sadly as Jon walked into the keep through the side entrance, the one that led to the Lord's kitchen. The cooks were busy preparing the day's dinner, cooking the many roasts and joints of beef that were the foundation of northern cooking. We've 100 different ways to cook beef. The northern cow was as muscular but leaner than its southern cousin, though it had a coat of fur so thick peasants sheared them to make clothes and blankets. Not a single part of the animal was left to go to waste. The bones were milled into meal and sown in the fields to make the crops grow strong, the marrow was boiled to make broth, the balls and the rest of that area were usually thrown to the dogs or given to the poor. The organs were made into sausages and given to the guards, or to the night's watch, as a good dry beef sausage could last for nearly a year in a cupboard, and forever, if kept cool in the buttery underground. We must be the only castle in the 7 kingdoms that has their granary packed with sausages. He calmly walked through the kitchen, the servants too busy with their cooking to pay him much attention. The smell of hearty beef and ale stew wafted through the air strongly, making his belly growl. Round loaves were flipped in the wood ovens, trenchers, ready for the men-at-arms. Plates of trifle pewter were cleaned and another cask of ale rolled up from the buttery, not drinking but to be added to the sauces. His mouth watered, but he forced himself onwards, past a small basket of little buns decorated with the 7-sided star, smelling ever so slightly of cinnamon and raisins. They were for the September, he knew, they were for one of the holidays of the faith, something to do with Huger of the Hill being brought back 7 times. Just one couldn't hurt, but I shouldn't take it for free. It wouldn't be right. He looked around and waited till everyone's back was turned. Then he quickly snatched one from the basket and walked out before anyone could notice, swapping it for the silver coin he planned to give the boy earlier. The great hall was busy, crowds beginning to fill up the room for when his father held court. The ceiling was high, with thick oaken rafters holding up a steep roof. The dais was wide and high, big enough that a dozen could be feasted on the high table in comfort and 1,000 more beneath the salt, maybe more if they removed the proud statues that lined the walls. Tapestries rot, paintings fade, but statues are forever. He slipped through the crowds, staying in the rear, till he reached a stairwell and started his way up to his room on the 3rd floor, finishing the bun on his way up. Then, right as he was about to walk out the stairwell, he heard Wyler Mandaly and his brother Rob on the other side, walking past. Like a number of the North's maidens, she had her eyes on the stark air. Ever since To and Ed got drunk with Rob and found out he likes girls who have their hair down, Alis had let her hair grow long and kept it unbraided, then Wyler followed. She was a pretty girl, one who genuinely enjoyed being at Winterfell, but she also helped represent her family's interests. I can't let Rob see me like this. I know that you don't have the power to do it yourself, but can't you talk to your father? Convince him. Rob sighed. I don't think he would agree. You've got a great charter already, but to make White Harbor a staple port. It's not that big of a change, not really. Most of the towns on the White Knife send their goods downriver to sell them at White Harbor anyway. It would just be making it official, that's all. I'll think about it. Thank you. Wyler said cheerfully, followed by the sound of a peck on Rob's cheek that almost made Jon burst into laughter. Finally, one of them walked off, then Rob opened the door to the stairwell, looked at Jon once and sighed. You heard all that, didn't you? I did, he answered with a teasing smile. What would Alis think? I think she'll be wondering why you're dressed like a black Pharaoh. Rob smiled back, crossing his arms. What would Mother do if she saw you wearing that? I didn't see anything if you didn't, he offered. Rob nodded. Fine by me. Then he laughed. Who would have ever thought being surrounded by pretty girls could be so bad? Jon stepped out of the stairwell, closing the door behind him, just in case someone walked up on him from behind and saw his distasteful clothes. What do you mean? You know what I mean, Jon. It'd be so much simpler if I could just marry Alis and Wyler, or all the ladies. I wouldn't have to resist either of them. Or any of the others. Isn't that what Moontear is for? That doesn't get rid of the dishonor of deflowering a lady, though. Jon shrugged before answering half seriously and half japing, that didn't stop Uncle Brandon. He must have slept with half the North if the stories are true, and he was honorable. A lot of people thought he was more of a man because of it. Rob paused to think for just a moment. Then he smiled, a wide, happy smile, that horrified Jon to his core. Rob, you're not actually serious, are you? No, don't worry. I've got a plan. He walked right past Jon and down the stairs, never losing his smile and leaving Jon alone in the hall. He rushed to his room and got changed into a different set of clothes as quickly as possible, throwing his black fur collet into his dresser where hopefully no one would see them till he got rid of them. Then he ran back down the stairs to stop his brother from making a horrible mistake. Or, a really good one. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Notes. Well, this post was fun to write. Not quite as long as the last one, I think, but still big. Like I said at the start of it, Jon is a radically different character than he is in canon, never having grown up with the stigma of being a bastard, but in a culture where such a thing was accepted, kinda like Dawn. In canon, there was a point in Jon's childhood where he wasn't allowed to pretend to be the Lord of Winterfell anymore whenever he played games with Rob. Well, simply put, that never happened. On the contrary, he's been told that he would grow up to be the lord of his own castle one day. He's been surrounded from youth by other boys and girls, some older than him and some younger, too, so he's going to know of more adult things than in canon, like Moontear. Hell, Rob knows about the stuff. One of the things Jon has actually been trying to deal with is finding a set of colors he likes, some words, a crest and a name for his house once he gets landed, so he's trying to get as much of that done before he gets his title, and of course, a wife. He had almost settled on some colors till he realized they were the same ones as the Black Fyress. That wouldn't be a problem for him, but Catelyn's reaction would probably make the doom of Valyria look tame. And of course, a butterfly from a wealthier north, Jorah has just enough money to keep Lyonesse happy, so he never had to sell the poachers into slavery and thus stayed on the right side of the law, keeping Longclaw and having children with his wife. Daisy is pretty much his representative at Winterfell, speaking on behalf of the Mormont family during whenever Ned holds court. Which is another reason why there are sons and daughters from the different regions. The North is developing, so every choice Ned makes has enormous consequences. A raise of taxes on wood, for example, slows down the construction of new buildings throughout the entire North, makes people migrate away from the forests in search of cheaper places to live and reduces most people's profits, but increases the amount of wealth in the hands of the nobility. He has to play a careful game of balancing the needs of his people with the desires of his nobles. The North before was empty and thus quite simple, but now that the population is much higher it has grown a hell of a lot more complicated. And, the West AOC version of the hot cross bun appears, mostly because I was snacking on one while writing the post, but we also see an insight into the northern diet, because it is based off cattle, there is a lot of meat. Thick steaks for feasts, stews for guards, dry sausages for long-term storage, which really can last for years in storage and practically indefinitely in the cold, and pretty much every single part of the animal. Of course, a family like the Starks will only ever eat the best parts of the animal, with different parts being more commonly eaten based on how wealthy a family might be. But they do eat things other than meat, it's just a really big slice of their diet. Incidentally, I actually did some research about this because I was wondering how many Northerners might have died from heart disease, and to my surprise it turns out Argentina has the highest beef consumption, eating around 59.4 kilograms per person last year, but they have surprisingly low death rates on things that are related to eating too much red meats. It turns out, the reason is they feed their cattle natural grass rather than grain-based feeds like in the US. This drastically reduces the amount of marbling and makes it much healthier to eat. So, no need to worry about Eddard Stark dying of a heart attack anytime soon. I'm sure that would have been a unique way for him to die in an Asoyaf story. And of course, Rob's getting himself into trouble. Now before you judge him too harshly, remember he's 14/15 and surrounded by pretty girls. And of course there was a subtle reference to a certain cooperative story. Next part will be a Sansa section. She got a mention in this part, too. She's been surrounded by northern ladies, so she's not quite the picture-perfect Southron she was before. Instead, her personality is more northern. You'll see what I mean. Oh, and I had to fudge the numbers of White Harbor up a little. 50,000 people in Kiev/White Harbor would be the same as it is estimated to be canon. So, if anything, that city would be higher, probably closer to 75,000 to factor in their own growth. Chapter 3, Sansa I. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Sansa let out a soft sigh as she looked from her window and saw her sweet, gentle Domeric playing his harp, all of her favorite songs, occasionally looking towards her with a smile she always returned. He was quiet, unlike many of the other boys at Winterfell, and he enjoyed playing the harp, learning about the past, and was as swift as a demon when on a horse. He even had the makings of a champion in the lists, as he had proved at White Harbor before. He was kind and caring, an honorable Northman. He was even friends with Robb and his pack and would always mount up to ride with them whenever they left Winterfell. He had his father's white eyes, but instead of them being as cold as ice they were warm, loving and friendly, like a gentle summer's snow. Once, she had found him listening to old Nan's stories besides her younger brother Brandon with genuine interest, eager to learn even more about the past. Then he took another book out from the library and headed into the Godswood with his harp in one hand and the tome in the other, idly playing as he read. It was like something out of a song, a fairy tale from the Age of Heroes. But why does it make father so sad? Her father always smiled to see her so happy and so clearly in love, but when he saw her and Domeric together, his smiles always turned to silent sadness. She had asked him, once, but he had never answered, never explained why it made him so sad to see. He had even seen Domeric play Alysanne to her, the song she liked the most out of all her favorites, a song he played so well it could make her cry, but he had froze the moment he saw the tears on her cheeks and heard the sound of Domeric's harp. He was so clearly in pain at the sight that Domeric stopped playing the song and started to play something more jolly and cheerful, an attempt at playing the Bear and the Maiden Fair on harp using only the highest and lowest notes, something that sounded so delightfully mad it made both of them burst into laughter at the sound of it and made even her solemn father smile again before continuing on his way. Has my father a soft spot for sad music? Or is it something else? Maybe John's mother played the harp, too. No one knew who John's mother was, but many people thought it was a charlatan, though Eddard had tried to quash the rumors. They always flared up every now and then, with company that was ever madder than the last time. Most people thought he had lain with someone at Harrenhal, but who changed from person to person. Wyler thought it might have been the daughter of Lord Went, Alyssa, who he was said to have comforted after she lost the title of the Queen of Love and Beauty. She died a year after the end of Robert's rebellion, slipping on the steps of the Kingspire Tower and breaking her neck when she hit the bottom, but Wyler thought she had thrown herself down them in grief. Ailys thought it was a charlatan, like many of the other ladies, but Dacey had certainly heard the strangest of the rumors when she visited a tavern a few years after her uncle Jorah was married and met a wanderer from across the narrow sea, who said that the reason that Jon Snow so strongly had the Stark looks was because Eddard had bedded his own sister and gotten her with child, but no one believed that, not even Dacey herself, who thought that it might have been one of the other maidens. Who could trace their line back to House Stark, maybe a Greystoke. We'll find out in a few years, when he tells Jon. Till then, there's no harm in guessing. Domeric leaned out the window from which he was playing and smiled at her again. She blushed as she smiled in return. Her ballroom was a well-decorated room inside the keep, beneath her bedchamber, but his chambers were at the top of the nearest tower, so she could look up and see him with ease just as he could look down and in through the opening if the shutters were open. Her ladies-in-waiting, barring Dacey, who was certainly no one's lady-in-waiting, no, she was closer to Rob's pack than she was to hers, were sat in a circle, practicing their sewing and eating delicious lemon cakes and other niceties that had been placed on the round table between them all. Besides her on the right was Wyler, her long blonde hair reaching down to a little past her shoulders and allowed to flow freely, as was the northern fashion, and on her left was Aelys Karstark, whose brown hair reached all the way down to her waist. Then, going around the table were girls from almost every major house in the north and definitely one from all the great branches. Just past Aelys was Lysara Snowsturk, who, even though she was only a year older than Sansa, was only a few inches shorter than the small Jon. She always tried to make herself look smaller than she really was simply because she towered over most men, most of whom stood eye level with her enviously plump bosom. Opposite her was the small Lyanna Swampstark, who was only a little taller than her brother Brandon, despite being a maiden flowered. Whereas all the other Stark girls had grey eyes, besides Sansa, who had her mother's blue, she had a light shade of green from her Crangewoman mother, but she had the same brown hair. She was almost like a doll when compared to Lysara, but she was beautiful in her own way, with a soft face and a softer heart. Then there were the dark Stark twins, Adra and Lyon, utterly identical in both looks and dress, aside from the single ribbon they wore in their hair so people could tell the difference between them. Adra had a simple black one and Lyon an orange, and though they dressed and looked the same, they acted differently. Adra had a fondness for men that went far beyond anything Septa Mordane would have approved of, though she had little interest in marriage. Lyon, on the other hand, was friendly but not lustful like her sister, delicate, polite and shy, at least around boys. She was very ladylike, Southron almost, something that had made Catelyn fond of the young Darkstark. Then there was the young Greystoke, the youngest lady there, a year younger than Arya, but she had grown mostly around Sansa, and of all, was the one closest to her. Little Lyra Greystoke followed Sansa everywhere she could, happy to help, and once she even carried messages between her and Domeric when the Septa tried to keep them separate, for whatever reason. I wished she was a real sister, like Arya. Then there were the others. Jane Poole, Eddara Flint, the younger sister of Robin Flint, Beth Castle, even Serena Umber, the great Jon's daughter, who was the only one who even came close to Lysara in height. Aelys giggled as she saw Sansa peer out the window again. It was a colder day than the usual, so the tall Karstark girl was wearing a thick fur coat above her dress, just like Sansa. "You truly love him, don't you?" she answered without a moment's hesitation. "I do." Then she smiled at the Karstark girl. "Just like you love my brother Robb." Aelys laughed, but Sansa could see the red coming onto her cheeks. Everyone knew how Aelys and Wyler loved Robb, and that he was torn between the two. Both of them were from good, loyal and powerful families, both of them kept the old gods. Wyler had converted back years before, and both the Aelys and the Karstarks were interested in seeing a daughter married to him. Both of them had flowered on almost the same day, and now they had their Mu, and both Wyler and Aelys love him. Gods, I don't know which he will marry. I would be surprised if he doesn't just flip a coin. She sighed, but then the doors opened quietly as the Septa stepped in, smiling at the ladies she taught. Sangza did not keep the new gods, she kept her father's gods, the gods of her ancestors and of all the Stark women who came before her. She was not some fragile Southron, but a proud northern woman, and though she didn't don chainmail like Daisy, she certainly wasn't a fragile flower who was seen and never heard. She went to the September with her mother because it was expected of her, her duty and the right thing to do, not because she wanted to or because she kept the new gods. She and most of the other ladies weren't fond of all the strictness of the faith, how it separated them from their gods with septons and septars and so on, but there were some parts that she was interested in, like the 7 holidays the faith had, one for each of the new gods. Mother's Day was a day to give thanks to the mother, but the septon told her that in the south sons and daughters gave gifts to their own mothers, too, as thanks for bringing them into the world. It was a wonderful idea in her opinion. She had even surprised her mother once by getting her favorite flowers from the glass gardens for her, something she did every year now. Septa Mordain walked around the table, smiling at their stitch work as she did. Even northern ladies were expected to learn how to sew, but they didn't make soft, fragile clothes like they did in the south. They made hardy coats lined with soft fur to keep them warm in the coldest winters, thick gloves to protect their fingers from the biting wind, and dresses that used cloth twice as thick as any beneath the neck. Lysara's fat fingers and large hands were better suited for a smith's hammer than the bone sewing needle she had, which was as big as it could be and still be small enough to make the stitches properly. Maybe it would be best if you had a knitting needle, instead. Lysara sighed in defeat, setting the needle, the thread and her work on the table. I can't be any worse with it. Sangza smiled at her reassuringly, hoping to cheer the giant woman. You'll be better with a larger needle, I'm sure. Lyra quickly nodded in agreement, smiling at her distant cousin. Jory muttered Adra quietly between stitches. Huh? What do you mean? She asked, not even looking at the cloth as she continued her sewing, creating a beautiful snowflake from blue thread as practice. We were talking about people we like. Jory's strong, and handsome, in his own way. Jory is a married man, Adra, with sons of his own, quickly pointed out the Septa. You shouldn't think of him like that. It's unladylike. Beth nodded as she took a lemon cake. He's happy, too. I only said that I liked him and that he was handsome, that's all. Besides, Lord Stark is much better looking. Sangza laughed as the Septa turned red at Adra's words. The only reason the Septa was there to teach them was because Caitlin had asked for it, not because any of the girls kept the new gods or even needed a Septa to teach them. But for her mother, she was happy to listen to what the Septa had to say, for her mother's sake. She tried to be the best daughter she could be, since she knew she had given her mother hell when she had been little, but she had grown out of it and had become ladylike by 6. Not like Arya, though. She hasn't changed since she was a babe, my wild little sister. I hope she marries someone who likes her the way she is, someday. Father says she has the wolf blood, that we all have a little of it, but she has the most. Before the Septa could utter a word to the wanton and utterly shameless Darkstark, the door opened again and Daisy walked in, wearing leathers that made her seem like Arya made tall. She walked over and asked, "Have any of you seen Arya?" The Septa glared at her. Wearing leathers was certainly not something any lady should do, but Daisy was more than just that. She could fight as well as any man, better than most even. She usually hunted in the woods with Rob and his friends, so it was no wonder Arya looked up to her the way Lyra did to Sangza. She took 2 walnuts from a bowl on the table, but she didn't bother to use the nutcracker besides them. She simply crushed them against one another one-handed, the loud crunch making the Septa wince. She's probably in the city again. Why? Sangza knew her sister well enough to know that she always went into the city whenever she could, even when their mother told her not to. She was like a shadow in how she could come and go with ease, vanishing in one part of the castle and then reappearing somewhere else, covered in dirt and grime but no worse for wear. Caitlin is wondering where she's ran off to again, the little wilderling. Daisy sighed. I best try and find her. Sangza nodded as Daisy left to start her search. She was sure Arya had found a way to disappear into the walls, but she wasn't sure how. Arya had been left in a room on her own with a guard outside the door, once, and she still managed to get outside the keep, but no one saw her leave the room or try and climb out of her window. Septa Mordane had mostly given up on trying to make Arya ladylike. She never showed up to the Septa's lessons and she definitely didn't have any interest in ever attending them, either. Their mother wished and prayed that Arya would finally relax and become a lady, but Brandon had wished to fly on an ice dragon once and it never happened. There's more of a chance of him turning into an ice dragon than Arya turning into a Southron lady. How unladylike, sighed the Septa. She would certainly get along well with Lord Tarthar's daughter. I thought ladies in the South weren't allowed to fight, asked Sayana. Aren't they just left in towers? Heavens no, Sayana. They are given free roam of their castles and can do whatever they please, like play the harp, read or spend time with their children. Is that it? She asked the old Septa. Is that all the ladies in the South do? I would go mad if that was all I did. I don't mind sewing and reading, but there are other things I like to do, like riding. Not at all. They watch their sons, husbands and brothers ride at tournaments and can be crowned the Queen of Love and Beauty, or organize feasts and other such things. The Septa added with a fond smile. But Daisy can go hunting, she could fight in the melee if so wanted to. Aren't there any women in the South like her? The Septa sighed. A few, but it's frowned upon, for good reasons. Lady Tarth, for example. She is as much a warrior as Daisy, but she'll never find a husband because of it. Didn't John want to marry Daisy before? She still remembered Daisy turning red with stunned embarrassment after what he did, so she never even gave him a moment's thought before turning him down. Had he done it in private, who knows what might have happened. The Septa sighed. Then she stayed quiet as she continued looking at their sewing. Are there any ladies like me? Asked Adra with a smile, knowing full well what she was asking. In Dawn, answered the Septa quietly and with shame. Wyler smiled as she showed their Septa her stitch work, a perfect copy of the merman of her house, every detail and every color correct. Well done, Wyler, it's beautiful. Your old Septa would be very proud, I'm sure. Thank you. Sansa reached over for a lemon cake. They were her favorite, everyone knew, but she was careful to avoid eating too many. They could only grow a few lemons in the glass gardens and the rest had to be shipped up from Dawn and the Reach, alongside oranges, melons and peaches. Every castle in the north has a glass garden, but ours are the biggest. She took a bite of the small and sweet cake, then she set her own sewing on the tabletop for the Septa to see. Then, when she was done with the lemon cake, she rose from her seat. Where are you going? Asked the Septa. She knows I'm the reason most of the ladies are here. I'm just going for a walk, I'll be back soon. The Septa nodded and as Sansa started towards the door, half the ladies rose from their seats to follow and then the other half did the same, leaving the Septa on her own, aside from Lion, who looked to the Septa. Can I go with them? You may. Only then did the shy but polite girl rise from her seat to follow Sansa outside and into the heart of the castle. Warmth flowed from the floors and walls, the pipes buried inside the masonry carrying hot water from the springs beneath the keep to every room, easily warming those few without hearths, even more so in the bathhouse where the pipes went beneath the tubs and kept them hot even in the midst of winter. She led her friends down the steps and outside, into the bright sun, just in time to see Robb look over and smile at Alis, who gladly smiled back as her cheeks turned a pale red. She laughed as Domeric stopped playing, then she walked through the courtyard to the rear of the castle, where the Godswood had stood long before the castle had been built, never changing as the castle grew around it and then the city around the castle. Cuttings and seeds from the ancient heart tree had been used to grow all the other woods in the city, even the young ones in the marketplace. The warm ponds bubbled and misted into the air amongst the old trees and truly ancient stones. It was a serene place, peaceful. Stark men and women had come to pray for centuries, or just to find some peace in their day-to-day lives. But she had another use for it. Because it's never hard to find him here after he leaves his chambers. My sweet lady Sansa spoke her love quietly from beneath an oak tree not far from the wood, silver harp in hand. Did you enjoy my music? She smiled at Domeric, a loving, tender smile. He had his father's eyes, and the same face, they even walked the same, but he was everything his father wasn't, loving, warm and friendly. His hair was neatly cut and kept short, the same blackish brown that his mother had. He never talked much, even to her, but he was the kindest, most loving man she had ever met. Others had tried to court her before, but none of them had ever gotten close to making her feel the way he had, and still could. She walked over and sat on the ground beside him, her ladies gathering around idly. They were going to be husband and wife one day, she knew, and nothing could make her happier. He's even friends with Rob. He's perfect. I always do. He smiled at her as he raised his harp and strummed the first few notes of another song, a long song, but a summer one she knew well. The Winter Maid, though the maiden in the song is certainly not as beautiful as you. She giggled as she rested her head upon his shoulder and let him play, just as she had so many times before. Asterisk 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 asterisk. End of part 3. Notes. I'll say it now, sorry. Writing this part was a frigging slog, uphill through a blizzard with others all around. It was very hard to make this part actually work, and even now I'm not entirely happy with it. It's hard to describe, but something just doesn't feel right with it. It's probably caused by the part taking a couple of days to finish skewing some things, but I'm not sure. Still, if it's unreadable and just flat out horrible, just say and I'll try and rewrite the thing till it's better. Though I'm sure future songs or parts won't be quite as problematic as this one, to say the least. Anyhow, to recap, as I always do at the end of my parts. Songs are really loves Domeric, as if that wasn't obvious enough. However, he should sound a little familiar, for reasons that should be very clear. He loves to play the harp, and is exceptionally good at it. Then he has a truly ravenous appetite for learning about the past and is generally quiet and friendly. He's a really good guy, friends with Robb Stark and enjoys riding horses. Certainly, he'll be a great jouster as he gains more experience and gets older. Oh, and he's courting a Stark girl. I wonder who this is like. Oh boy, Robert Baratheon is going to have fun with him, that's for sure. Sansa's not quite the perfect and mild-mannered lady she was in canon. Instead, she's a northern lady. Now, I don't mean she's wild like Arya or Lyanna, she's not, but she's not Southron, either. She doesn't mind sewing, but she likes to ride horses, go on walks, that kind of thing, but she also loves her sister, even if she can be a pain in the backside sometimes. And we also see a lot of northern ladies in this part, too. Wyler hasn't got green hair simply because she hasn't dyed it, but more importantly, she converted back to the old gods. We'll see more about that in more politically minded parts further on, once all the Starks have had their part. But they vary from one another, certainly. And of course, Lyon should sound a lot like Lysa, before she married Jon Arryn. This leads me to something else, because northern culture is stronger and more people have first men style ideals and the like. Catelyn is a little more isolated than she would be in canon. Oh, she still loves her children and Eddard, certainly, but she's alone in that she is one of the few in the city who have Southron values, but this'll be covered more deeply in her part. Now, some of you are probably wondering why there is the traditional mix of Stark-style names, Lyanna, Lyon, Lysara and so on, and then Edra. The reason for this is that Edra is the name of the girl from the Ice Dragon, and I mean the version published in 1980. That book is sort of the grandfather to Asoyaf. Hell, it even mentions the North. However, that version of the North has dragons. So, I didn't think it would do too much harm to have that as a northern name, as a little nod to that which created the franchise we all know and love. Tongue-poking smiley. Oh, and if I remember right, it also gives us a clue towards the origin of the others. The girl is cold emotionally as well physically, and her mother died giving birth to her because the cold of the long night touched Edra while she was still in the womb. I don't think it's much of a leap for Jory to be married in this timeline, either. He's not married to anyone of high nobility, but he is happily married with children of his own. Chapter 4, Arya I. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Arya put her ear up against the warm wall of her chamber, quietly listening out for any movement inside the castle's halls. Sometimes, the guards who tried so hard to keep her inside the castle at her mother's request would walk down the hall and stay there instead of standing outside her door, hoping to catch her as she left her room. But that never works. I don't leave my room by going out the door. She smiled to herself as the guard walked a few feet away, only to stop and wait for her to try and escape. She had been in a chamber close to the ballroom, once, but her mother had moved her higher up the castle to try and stop her from leaving. But Arya had found the perfect method. one that never required her to even walk out the castle gate to leave it. She changed out of the uncomfortable dress her mother made her wear, and into the leathers her father had given her for 9th name day. He knew that, no matter what he tried, she would always find a way to escape and would ruin any dress she wore in the process. So, he had gotten her tough, hard-wearing boiled leathers, like the ones Daisy wore around Winterfell, knowing that she adored the proud, strong Mormont she bare. Catelyn still tried and make her a lady, but it was a losing battle and one that she was trying to fight less and less as Arya grew older. She tiptoed across the room, putting on her tough leather boots and thick gloves, then she lay on the floor and rolled beneath her bed that had been pushed as far as it could be against the wall opposite the door, her drawers covering the other side. Years ago, when she was much smaller, she had been playing in her room when she slipped and fell against the stone walls of her chamber when she was still downstairs, and to her surprise, the block she hit slid back into the wall. The keep had thinner walls on the inside than it did on the outside, to allow heat to pass through the brickwork from the pipes that had been placed in the small gaps in between, and by chance, she had found a block that had come loose over the centuries. The block had slid backwards, into the gap between the outside walls and the inside ones, just enough room for a man to squeeze inside to mend the pipes in case they ever burst. She had carefully moved the block back to its place, but she never said a word to anyone about it happening, not a soul. Eventually, she had been moved from that room and a mason noticed the loose brick during an inspection and mortared it back into place, sealing that entrance, but she had made another in her new chamber, beneath her bed so that no one would ever find it, not without taking all her furniture out, and even then they needed a trained eye to notice the difference between it and all the others. They'll never know. She smiled as she slowly pushed the block back into the opening inside the wall, just enough that she could squeeze into the opening. Then she crept forward ever so slowly, careful to not make a sound. Hot air brushed past her face from the dark passageway, but she continued, putting her arms inside and pulling herself in. The broad copper pipes that heated Winterfell loomed all around her, like metal tree trunks, rising from and climbing into darkness. There were only a few stone walkways that the builders had used centuries ago, but it was too dark to see them properly, too risky that she could miss a step and fall to her death in the abyss below. Carefully, she reached out onto a pipe. The copper was thick, soft and as hot as boiling water, but the fixtures that held them in place were made from iron and cold enough to hold. She grabbed hold of the fitting with one hand, then she pushed the block back into its place, removing her only source of light. She had done this 100 times before and would do it 100 times again, but she had never, would never, get used to the complete, suffocating darkness that surrounded her. Her eyes were useless, so she listened carefully for the quiet flow of the water inside the pipes and used her hands to find the fitting. Carefully, she put both hands on the fitting and then stepped off the platform and onto the pipe, finding another set of fittings beneath her feet where the pipe branched into a dozen smaller ones to warm the floor beneath her chamber. The air was filled with dust and damp, making her throat itch. Through the wall, she heard the sound of her door's hinges. "Arya, it's time for your lessons." Her mother sighed as the guard rushed into the room. "Others be damned, she's escaped." "I was watching the door, she never left the room." Catelyn sighed again, then she heard the patter of footsteps as she walked out the room, leaving the guard to search for her, even though she knew he would never find her inside the wall. Her throat tingled, pleading with her to cough the dirt away. Her footing was safe upon the pipes below, but if she coughed, the guard would hear, and she would never be able to use the tunnels again. It had taken her weeks to loosen the block enough that she had been able to move it, not like the first loose block, but if they knew she had been using the passageways they would simply move her into a room in the center of the keep, away from any of the outside walls and keep a guard outside the door, just in case. The itching turned to burning, so she did the only thing she could. She took her right hand from the iron fitting and bit down on it. Then she coughed. The sound was silent, or so she hoped. Finally, the guard sighed. "I'll never know how she does it." She placed her hand back on the rail and smiled as the guard left, his footsteps growing quieter as he got further and further away. That was close. She smiled, then she crouched down and reached to the next fitting below her, knowing exactly where it was by memory from all the times she had done it before. When she felt the familiar shape in her grip, she grabbed it with her other hand and very carefully rolled off the pipe, never loosening her vice-like grip till she was against the copper again. "I know that if I fall, they might never find me, but it's worth the risk. A wolf shouldn't be caged in, ever. The hardest part of her escape was done, but now she had to descend into the hungry void beneath her, one that she had only ever seen lit by candlelight. I had to stop using candles, though. I couldn't explain where they were going. She wrapped her legs around the hot copper pipe, feeling the warmth burning its way through her leggings, then she quickly threw her arms around it and slid down to the next fitting. They were there to hold the pipes upright, so that they didn't start to bend under their own weight, but they made the perfect handholds. She quickly let go of the pipe and grabbed the next fitting. The cold iron was much more comfortable to hold through her gloves than the hot copper. She panted for breath in the heat, resting for a little while. It had been much harder when she had first started using the tunnels to leave. Her arms had been smaller, weaker, burning from the exertion after just a few descents, but like hot steel being bathed in a vat of cold water, it had made her harder and stronger. I'll be just as strong as Daisy one day. She held herself on with one hand as she brushed sweat from her face before she continued climbing down, wrapping herself around the pipe and sliding down, just like before. She heard a proud man speaking on the other side of the wall, his voice having an accent she couldn't place. He was obviously a nobleman, though, she could tell by how confident he spoke. Of soldiers, trained to fight as a group and not as warriors in single combat, not like the other peoples of the world at the time, they were a. She heard her brother instantly reply. A pack. I can hear anything in the castle, if I can get to the rooms. She quietly stepped onto another set of pipes, the ones that led into whatever room was besides her, quietly moving as her brother continued talking strategy with the unknown man. I wish I was taught that instead of learning how to sew. She sighed, then she continued on her way down, into the bowels of the castle. As Rob's voice faded away, she heard another coming from the room below. Salad Horsaran is the greatest threat to our merchantmen, my lord. They call him the Prince of the Narrow Sea, but if you give me leave to attack his lair in the Stepstones, I'll make his reign a short one, and tow the Valerian back as a prize, too. She recognized the voice from one of his many visits, Ricard Seastook. His brother ruled the lands of his family, so he commanded their fleet, and the open seas were more his home than any castle, now. The Seastooks and the Mondalis shared the duty of protecting the North's trade with the Free Cities and the East Coast, while the Mormonts and the Darkstarks protected the western coast. He was older than her father, his brown hair having long turned as grey as his eyes, but with his age had come experience, and on either side of the narrow sea he was known as a seasoned commander of ships and a pirate hunter, and he was like a grandfather to her. He had never had any daughters of his own, while all his nieces had died either in the womb or in the cradle, so he loved her as if she were both. He told her stories about his travels and visits to the Free Cities, but he also sometimes brought her presents from across the narrow sea as proof, even though she never doubted him. Her father replied after a moment's thought, "Take as many ships as you need to put an end to his attacks, once and for all." She continued her way down, but this time, she saw a flickering light from the bottom, an orange glow from the torches in the cellars shining up from a grate, the lone light in the ocean of darkness. It was the entrance that the builders used when they were inspecting the pipes or replacing the iron fittings, as the only alternative was to smash their way through the walls of the castle itself with sledgehammers and picks, which was as awkward and tedious as it was costly. She looked away from the light, but kept going down, keeping her mind focused on the things she couldn't see instead of those that she could. The wet, swamp-like heat of the tunnels gave way to a drier cold as she got closer and closer to the bottom, the draft rising past her and working its way through her leathers to the damp skin beneath. She was used to the cold, everyone in the north was, but to be sweating from the heat and then suddenly surrounded by the cold again would make another shiver, but it was relaxing, like staying in Winterfell's bathhouse for a while before diving into the ponds. We don't bathe like they do in the south. They sit in tubs of warm water, but we use steam and sit around hot coals with our friends, but we do have baths like they do, too. That manner of bathing was even popular among the common, as it was easy to afford the fuel and the one building could serve many roles, food could be cooked on the coals, the building was big enough to live in and many women gave birth in them, like her grandmother had when she brought her father into the world, though her mother preferred a birthing bed. There was nothing in the world half as relaxing as sitting in the steam in the midst of a cold winter, though the people of the south thought there was something perverse about the Night's Watch doing it for an hour's relief from the cold, calling them sword swallowers and other foul things. Every fitting brought her a little closer to the grate at the bottom, a little closer to being able to wander the streets of Winterfell away from the restrictions her mother tried so hard to put on her. The light grew brighter as she got closer, then finally, she stepped down onto cold, wet stone and not another layer of pipes. She dried her hands on her breeches as best as she could, then she listened out for the sounds of anyone moving in the buttery, peeking through the gaps between the gaps, only daring to move again when she was sure there was no one around to see her. Carefully, she gripped the old grate and pulled. It was heavy, too heavy for her, but she didn't need to lift it high, just enough to raise the edge, just enough that she could slide it far enough for her to fit past. I've done this before, but it's still hard. There was a clunk as it raised out of place, and she turned red as she used all her strength to heave it across the damp masonry, careful to avoid making too much noise that could be heard over the sound of the kitchens clattering above her. She was strong as Bran if not stronger, but the grate was meant to be lifted by grown men, masons used to hammering and hewing at blocks for hours on end, but she managed to move it just enough, just barely, that she could slip through, even if it was a tight fit. She placed her arms on either side of the opening and lowered herself down, easy when compared to her earlier climb. Her brother Brandon used to climb the towers of Winterfell before he learned he could soar above them in the body of an eagle, and she had done the same before her mother forced her to stop, and Ned had agreed with her, saying that it was too dangerous because of how tall the towers were, and that a strong gust of wind or a loose stone would send her plummeting to her death. She stopped climbing them. Her mother tried to stop her from doing many things, but her father was happy to let her be how she wanted to be. He let her go hunting with Robb, go riding with Daisy, anything she wanted to do within reason, so when he told her not to do something, she never did it. But now, her mother was finally starting to give up on trying to turn her into a lady, but that didn't bother Arya whatsoever. She reached up and moved the grate back into position before taking a quick look around. She was beneath Winterfell, in the buttery where they stored the ales, beers and all the other drinks for the serving men at arms of the castle. On either side of her were shelves packed with casks of ale and beer, with even more stacked neatly against the rear wall behind her. Ahead of her were 4 huge tuns with chunky taps and iron ribs as wide as her hands that held the ales as they aged, and between the monstrous barrels were shelves of wooden kegs, suckling babes when compared to the giants all around them. A few torches lit the cellar well enough, and from the smell of cooking meat and the clamor of utensils, she knew they were already starting to work in the kitchens above. They'll be coming for the ale, soon. Arya quickly moved behind the tun on her right, then waited a brief moment before moving again, in case anyone started to come down the steps opposite her on the left. She waited after every move, even if only for a few seconds. It was hard to tell exactly where the cooks were over the noise, so she made sure none of them were coming before moving again, just in case. They'd ask how I got down here, I wouldn't know what to say. She knew where every room in Winterfell was, even the ones beneath the castle. Just further ahead was the granaries where they kept food for winter, then the cisterns were just opposite that, doing the same but for water instead. Then past that was the bottlery, where they kept the wine, but it was a smaller room than the buttery and not her way out, either, but besides that was a tunnel that joined the Great Keep to the First Keep, the ancient and squat fortress that had been its predecessor thousands of years ago. So many sons and daughters of the Lords of the North had been sent to Winterfell, more coming every generation, that it was a challenge to house all of them with quarters fitting their status, so the First Keep had been restored in the days of her grandfather's grandfather. She had seen maps of Winterfell from then, from a time when the city was a growing town and the Barbicans were still being raised. Nowadays, the castle itself was like a town in its own right, with scores of armorers, polar turners, swordsmiths and fletchers working and living inside the walls. Mikken was but the first of many blacksmiths who had the hard duty of ensuring that the city watch and the castle guards always had weapons and armor, and that they were in good condition, too. She started to creep forward again, only allowing herself to relax after she had left the buttery and was in the quiet halls below the castle. There was no one there, not even a guard, even though there was a stairwell that led behind the great hall. She walked openly, unafraid of being found and dragged to her boring lessons. I hate sewing. Why does she keep trying to make me like her? Arya sighed. She and her mother had never been as close as they could have been. When Arya had been a child so young she was still in swaddling, her mother had hoped that she would grow up to be more ladylike than her sister, more Southron, but her dream of having a daughter like her had come crashing down as Arya grew older and older. First, When she learned how to run and after her brother was born, she had played games in the castle with her brother Bran, ruining every dress she owned, even the ones Caitlin had made for her, but her sister Sansa had done the same except with Robb, Jon and all the others. Then she had grown more defiant with every name-a-day, attending the lessons of the Septa less and less, never going with Caitlin to the September, and then she met Daisy. She was everything Arya ever dreamed of being. She was strong, fierce and proud, an honorable warrior. But above all, she was independent. She didn't need a husband to protect her, to provide for her or to take her from one place to another. She could crush wildlings and knights alike with her mace, she could hunt as well as any of her brothers and she certainly didn't need any help getting around. She can mount up on her horse and just ride anywhere she wants, whenever she wants to. She could go fight across the narrow sea, or enter a melee in a tournament, or go hunting or anything other than sewing. But Caitlin won't even let me go into the city without 24 guards. Robb and Jon go by themselves. Nothing frustrated her more than having to fight such an uphill battle with her own mother, especially when her father was so understanding of her and everything she wanted to do. He never once tried to contain her, no, he let her roam free and wide, allowing her to be the she-wolf she was and not trying to make her into a fragile winter rose. She walked past the thick, reinforced oaken doors that led to the cisterns and granaries, then in front of her loomed the much weaker door made from pine, the entrance to the bottlery. In a siege, food and water became far more valuable than any bottle of wine. Drunks can't fight. They just shamble, like the whites in old Nan's stories. There was a quiet working inside the room, the occasional patter of tools as they made sure every barrel and every bottle was properly sealed. But she didn't care about that. She cared about the door besides her that was there so that meals and drink could be taken through to the first keep if needed, or to let Robb's friends make it back to their chambers in winter if too much snow had fallen. Behind it was a metal gate, she knew, one that was always left open in day for anyone wandering between the two buildings, but closed and locked at night. She smiled as she opened the door, only to hear the clank of chainmail and a painful grunt as the door hit someone on the other side. "Hey!" yelled the guard in anger, but his tone made it clear he didn't recognize who she was. He would have never dared to raise his voice if he had. The dirt on her clothes and in her hair had made her look much poorer than she really was, like a serving boy and not the high-born lady she really was. It was her best disguise, since she didn't have to do anything to make her look any different than she normally did. All she had to do was put on her normal leathers and then go through the tunnels. The moisture and heat made the dirt and dust stick to her so well it was impossible to get it all off without having her clothes washed and then bathing, either in the southern fashion or the northern one. He was young, tall and strong, too, with rough long features and only a few brown hairs making it out from beneath his kettle helm and coif, but he had the same grey eyes, too. His hauberk stretched to just past his knees, wedged between two layers of leather and fastened with a strong belt. Had he been wearing a coat of plate on top, he would have recognized her instantly, as those were only common amongst the household guard, the best swords and crossbowmen in the castle. He swayed ever so slightly as he stood in front of her, and smelled like ale. "Sorry," she apologized, keeping her head down towards the ground as if in shame, ensuring he couldn't see her face properly. "Where are you going, anyway? You don't even have anything in your hands. You're not supposed to use the tunnel as you please." She sighed. It was going so well. She looked him dead in the eye and watched as he realized who he was talking to. His entire posture and tone changed in an blink. "Milady. I didn't reckon." "Stay quiet," she demanded without any softness in her voice, the same lordly tone her father used, though hers was more like a mummer's acting than his. "You didn't see me. But your lady mother has asked for you to be taken to her." Arya crossed her arms, as Daisy usually did at times like this. "You're going to take me to my mother while smelling like ale?" The guard sighed. "Please don't tell Jory, or anyone." Arya smiled at the guard. "I didn't see you, if you didn't see me." He paused for a moment, then he nodded and stepped to the side to let her pass before going through the door himself and leaving her alone in the tunnel. It left her confused as she walked through the tunnel to the first keep. Why was the guard in the basement in the first place? There had never been one beneath the castle before and she had made the descent from her room 100 times, never once being caught. Had they finally started to figure out how she was leaving the castle? It was bound to happen eventually, but how did they figure it out? Maybe the guard was just thirsty. The tunnel connecting the Great Keep with the First Keep was long, but well lit and warm, with the smooth granite blocks and the earth around them keeping out most of the cold, while warmth from both keeps and the torches on the walls warmed it. At the far end of the tunnel was another door, the exact same as the one she had walked through before. There shouldn't be any more guards, unless they know this is how I get out. She kept moving, opening the door and going up the stairs, into the ground floor of the First Keep. It was much smaller than the one she lived in, but it was still a large, strong building, with gargoyles watching over the courtyard like stony sentinels. The interior was well furnished, far better than it had been when it had first been built thousands of years ago, with some rooms that were no longer needed, like the Lord's Solar, being turned either into storage or into new chambers for the lords and ladies that had come to Winterfell. Now, it was like one large house, with a common room on the ground floor in what had used to be the little keep's own hall, with the stairwell just outside the entrance to the room and directly opposite the door. She crept up the stairs, onto the ground floor, then she heard snoring from inside the hall. She peeked around the corner and saw Eddard Karstark asleep at the table in only his breeches, catching up on sleep after training, with a cup of wine besides him. From the door in the back of the room, Torrhen stepped into the hall, holding a branch of birch tightly with both hands, careful to avoid making too much sound. He saw her in the doorway, and mouthed her name before placing a finger over his mouth to keep her quiet. "Oh, this is just evil." She grinned as Torrhen took one step at a time towards his slumbering, defenseless brother. They were as close as she was with her brothers, but they liked to play pranks on one another whenever they could. Eddard had filled his brother's wineskin with egg yolks last week, the same day that Roderick made them run around the castle in their plate armor to build endurance, and Tor had been so thirsty he drank half of it before he realized. He raised it over his shoulder as he might an axe. Then he shouted, at the top of his voice. "It's steam time, Ed." Ed snapped awake, barely getting out a sound before his brother sprung into action. "What?" Tor swung the branch, the leaves hitting his brother on the back with a loud crack, half the twigs snapping instantly and drawing thin tears of blood. Eddard threw himself from the table and straight towards his brother, who burst into a sprint as fast as he could, laughing as his tired brother slammed into the cold, hard floor with a soft, painful thump. Eddard shouted every curse she knew about, and a few she didn't, then charged after his brother, into the back of the keep. She laughed as she walked outside, into the cold but bright day. No Southron would ever birch themselves, but our men do it all the time when they bathe. It gets the blood flowing. From there, it was a simple walk out the castle, so long as she kept her head down and didn't draw any attention to herself. She looked towards the ground as she walked, hands in her pockets, raising her shoulders a little higher to make herself look a little more masculine. Carts rolled past her, bringing all sorts of goods to the castle, whether they be iron ingots for the smiths, granite boulders for the masons or slabs of meat and baskets of vegetables for the cooks. A few guards looked around curiously, no doubt looking for her, but none of them managed to recognize her as she walked. Winterfell's walls were high and strong, dotted with tall round towers and with enough hoardings in storage for every section of wall in times of war. But more prominent were the reddish-white symbols on the walls, made from a mix of wood bark and sap, water and egg whites, protective runes drawn directly onto the masonry and allowed to harden, promising to protect the defenders and her family from harm, so long as they stayed within. Maester Lewin doesn't think they do anything. He thinks that since people believe they are safe it'll make them fight harder, but I don't know. She couldn't read many of them, but the ones she could read said home, protect and fight. Not many people in the north could read an entire phrase of them, even less below the neck, but the green men from the Isle of Faces could not only read them all, but write them. They had a group in the north, men who were as silent as the old gods and tended to the wood trees and ensured they were in good health. They took cuttings from the largest woods and used them to grow new ones in the towns, cities and castles that were springing up across the north like mushrooms after a summer's rain. They carved the faces now that the children of the forest were gone, and some thought that a few of them had the green sight, and that every single one of them was a master warg. But no one could know for sure. All they knew was that only they wrote the runes on the walls, and that they came every time they needed to be rewritten, even when they hadn't yet been called. They spoke and met with lords only rarely, but whenever they did they spoke as the voice of the old gods, and none in the north ever ignored what they had to say. Why would we? She walked into the city, into the bustling and busy streets. The people were going about their day-to-day lives, shopping in the markets, praying in the godswoods, going to and from their workshops. She relished in the feeling that no one in the crowd knew she was a noble woman, that she was Arya Stark of Winterfell and not some common boy. She happily walked through the streets of the city, looking around at the shops and people. The shops so close to the castle were the wealthiest, larger and better built, with the odd one out being a bakery that had a glass front for some reason. Don't they know they lose heat through the glass? She walked into one of the alleyways, always curious to see more of the city that was her home. The streets closest to the castle were all cobblestone, dotted with trees along the sides besides the gutters. The houses usually had a dozen people inside, if not more, and were strongly built if sparingly decorated. But there were statues, of the great Stark heroes from ages long since past, even though they were buried in the crypts below, with their direwolves besides them even in death. They stood tall and proud, giants made from bronze, the eldest of which had started to turn green with time. The North was fond of sculptures and statues, they were eternal, ageless, just as the North was. The kingdom had seen castles rise and fall across the world, armies march from glorious victory to crushing defeat, pretenders rallying and dying upon bloody meadows, but the North had remained throughout it all. For 8,000 years the Starks had stood unbroken. What was the Seven Kingdoms to such agelessness, but the blink of an eye, a single moment that would be swept away by the winds of history? They watched as they had always watched, and she smiled at the statue of a she-wolf from the past, Aelane Stark, called the Fishwife, because she spent her days gutting squids whenever the opportunity presented itself. She had short hair, all the better to fit beneath her great helm, and wore a hauberk, carrying sword and shield into battle, and besides her was her direwolf, a she-wolf that was as fierce as her master. She had only stopped fighting the Ironborn when her brother took Bear Island from them in a wrestling match, but till then she had eagerly boarded their ships and fought the raiders on their own vessels, or took them by surprise whenever they came ashore. On an open beach where the Ironborn had just landed, a direwolf was dangerous, but when she caught them by surprise on their own ships and boarded them, they were deadly. She was so eager for life at sea and in battle that her brother gave her the task of protecting the trade routes of the Narrow Sea, making her the first of the Sea Starks after she married one of her cousins and set to work building her lands into a port. I wish I had a direwolf. The cobblestone streets gave way to rough dirt paths as she moved away from the wealthiest part of the city and into the poorer sections where most of the people lived and worked. There weren't any statues here, but they still had godswoods, and every godswood had its own heart tree around which the people would pray. The buildings around her were still large, so as to house any cousins or family they might have had outside of the city in winter, but they were more cheaply built and mostly made from wood, not stone. Some had steam baths, but they were few and far between, shared amongst friends and family and sometimes used for other things, like smoking meats. The city watch were out in force, patrolling the city in squads and always watched from above by wargs in their golden eagles. Each group of men had 2 crossbowmen, a weapon that was beloved by the guards for how easy they were to use and maintain, not to mention how they could be loaded and carried around on a long patrol, ready to be fired in a moment's notice. But more importantly, they were led by veteran watchmen, those who had served the watch for 10 years and been given the authority by her father to pass sentences on his behalf. Our way is the old way, but he can't be everywhere. He needs the guards to deal with most of the regular crimes so he can deal with more important things. There weren't as many guards as there were in the other cities of Westeros, but they were better equipped, and ever present. Their wargs allowed them to see every crime in the city, then deal with them when the opportunity presented itself. They were everywhere, and no crime in the streets of Winterfell ever went unpunished, which is why she found her mother's insistence that she be escorted into the city so strange. Why did she need guards, when the streets were so safe? Further down the street, she saw a group of the Snowcloaks, because their blue cloaks were covered in large white spots, armored with brigandines over leather, thick boots and open-faced salets, with a variety of weapons. And following them, was a bear, with reddish-brown fur covered in scars and with long, thick claws that looked as though someone had put them against a whetstone and sharpened them. The group walked along the road, people stopping to watch as the bear walked towards one of the houses and tapped on the door with its claws 3 times. The guards walked over, talking amongst themselves, then the leader of the group, more heavily armored than the others and wielding an axe, walked past the bear and smashed the hinges with 3 swings of his heavy weapon. Then the bear walked inside, followed by the others. Shouts echoed from inside, alongside the bear's fierce roar, but then the group walked out casually, as though they had never been there in the first place, except this time, being held in the bear's arms was a grown man, struggling against its grip. "I didn't steal anything," he shouted, pleading with the men to let him go. The sergeant laughed. You did." He walked over to the defenseless man and reached a mailed hand into the left pocket of the man's breeches, and pulled out a silver ring, decorated with beautiful, gleaming sapphires. The thief went as pale as snow and fell silent. An eagle had simply watched him go home after he stole the ring, then a group of guards had went there at their leisure. "No one can hide from them, except me." The guards of the north were happy to give their prisoners the opportunity to go to the wall. There was honor in serving the watch, and a chance to redeem one's crimes in the eyes of the gods, and when a crime such as stealing was to either lose a hand or take the black, many chose the latter rather than live the rest of their life as a cripple and as a burden on their family. The Southrons might not remember the honor of the night's watch, but we do. The guards walked off as the bear carried the thief away, the ward inside it protected inside the quarters of the city watch, where they were teaching her brother how to spread his wings and how to take an animal. He still wants to join the King's Guard, even as a warg. He'll be the first. She stretched before continuing on her walk, to a nearby godswood to rest for a little after her long climb and longer walk. It was a large wood, dozens of trees of all kinds scattered around, and in the center was a happy wood with a wide smile, crying red tears of joy, surrounded by quiet ponds that rippled in the low breeze and covered by the shadows of strong oaks that were only half as grand as the red-leafed heart tree. Worshippers were gathered around in a silent circle of a dozen rings, praying towards the tree, the only sound being the quiet murmur of the city and the rustling leaves as the wind blew through them. Their gods had no priests, no septs, no texts, nothing to separate a man from the gods they worshipped in their own way. All they had were the woods and the green men to tend to them. "Hello," Little Wolf spoke, an old and wise voice behind her. She turned to see a tall man, dressed entirely from head to heel in an flowing robe of green cloth, sewn together in such a way as to make it look like a dress of leaves. His belt was like bark, and in the darkness of his hood she saw a mask as white as bone, covering his entire face, aside from his kindly, emerald green eyes. He had seen through her disguise without even seeing her face, and he patted her on the shoulder lightly. "Your mother is worried. She fears something might happen to you. Are you not afraid?" "No," she answered calmly. She knew the risks of leaving the castle, but even for a simple and brief walk on her own it was worth it. "Good, there is no reason to be afraid. The gods are watching over you, Little Wolf. No harm shall come to you, for as long as you stay where they can see." She smiled. "If he thinks I'm safe outside the castle, then I must be. Can't you tell my mother that? Make her let me leave the castle when I want." The wise man chuckled. "I am afraid not, Little Wolf. She is simply doing what she believes is right. No god could ever fault a mother for doing what they thought was best for their kin. Is there nothing you wouldn't do for your pack?" "No." She loved her family, all of them, even her sister and her friends. Her brothers had smuggled her out of the castle on more than one occasion, with Rob and John even taking her hunting with them when they could. Her father told them all about how the lone wolf dies but the pack survives, and they had learned the lesson better than he could have ever imagined. They might not always get along with one another, but a pack of wolves had a feud every once in a while and they were no different. She might have been jealous of Rob and John being able to leave the castle whenever they wanted to, but that never stopped her from loving them. "We're a family, we look after each other." He nodded, surely smiling behind his mask, then he walked towards the tree, through the rings of worshippers, and he muttered something, a phrase in a tongue she didn't know, and when she blinked he had a bronze dagger in his hand. He carefully examined the wood, then on one of the stronger branches that were closer to the ground he carefully pulled down one of the mature but still new parts, careful to avoid breaking it. Then, with the bronze knife in hand, he made a small round cut around the branch, then another 2 inches further up. Then he stripped the flesh between, deep enough to get to the true wood inside, making his hands sticky with crimson sap as he spoke words of the old tongue. He said something else as he reached into his robe with the other hand, dagger vanishing into nothingness as he did, and pulled out a bag of cloth and a wineskin. He packed it with earth from all around him, then he got his dagger again, saying the strange phrase before it appeared, Then he cut through the open part of the branch, wiped it and uncorked the wineskin, pouring a mixture of honey and water onto the open part of the tree before driving it into the soil inside the bag, deep enough to take root. Then he picked it all up and walked over to her again, tree held in both hands. "Oh, by the way, would you mind keeping your brother away from any towers? For a few months." "Why?" she asked. "He doesn't like climbing anymore. He likes to fly instead." The robed man nodded in silence. Then he quietly said as the wind started to pick up, the leaves of the wood rustling more vigorously. "The branches of fate have been broken, little wolf. Not even the gods can know for certain what will come to pass now." He sighed as she stared at him in confusion. The wind settled. "I must go now, little wolf. This tree is to go to a new town in Brandon's Gift, then I shall head north of the wall." His tone lightened. "I hope we meet again, little wolf." She nodded and the robed man walked away, holding the tree across his shoulder and the sack in both hands without either seeming to slow him down. Finally, he called out to her from down the street, a single sentence before he continued on his way. "You will know what to do tomorrow, little wolf." "Huh?" She opened her mouth to ask him what he meant, but he disappeared into the crowds, even with the red hands of the wood over his shoulder. She blinked, then started to follow him, trying to trace his steps, but there wasn't a sign of him, aside from a single red leaf, left upon the ground and carried away in a cold breeze. Sighing, Arya turned back towards the wealthier part of town, knowing that she would have to return to the castle soon, else her mother might have the entire garrison sent out in search of her, like she had before, when Arya had fallen asleep beneath a pine tree in one of the godswoods. She had so utterly lost track of time that she had left after breaking her fast with her family, then woke just before dinner. She took a different path through the city, one where she looped around the godswood and into the city's main artery, the road from the marketplace to the gatehouse. It was a sprawling, busy road filled with carts of all shapes and sizes, drawn by horses, men and oxen. There were more statues there, taller, but besides them were posts of bronze as tall as a man, lamps filled with cow fat that burned like great candles, to light the streets in the dark winters and early nights of the north. They were a common sight in the more busy parts of the city, the parts where the merchants sold their goods and where the wealthy made their homes, but they were becoming more common in other parts of the city. Bronze was easy enough to make in the north, they still knew where all their best copper and tin mines were from centuries before, even if they weren't being used to make weapons and armor anymore. They made it safer to walk the streets of the city at night, but more importantly it let people see where they were going even in a snowstorm. Everyone knew the story of the man who had went out from his home to get more firewood only to get lost in the city and freeze to death after finally finding his street again. They only found him when the snow thawed. Old Nan told me the story, but Rob swears it's true. The marketplace was busier now than it was earlier, and her belly growled at her as the rich smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air from the same bakery that had the glass window. She could smell the sweet apple pies and spicy mint pastries from down the road, and when she walked over she looked through the glass window longingly at a small triangular pastry, cooked to golden perfection and sprinkled with sugar that sparkled in the light like diamonds. A thin waft of steam rose from a tiny hole in the top, carrying the splendid scent of slightly spiced apple, and her mouth began to water. She rummaged through her clothes for her coin purse, finding it in her breeches and almost ripping it apart in her haste to count her coins. There was a drawing of a stag beneath the mouth-watering dessert, but she could find no silvers in her purse, only coppers. She sighed sadly. Then someone walked up with a silver in hand. "Here," he offered, and she turned to see John, standing in black and red. She stared at him in shock. "He found me." "How?" He looked at her curiously, looking past her messy hair and dirty clothes and at her face, so she quickly reached out for the coin, knowing that to try and flee now would simply give her away even quicker. "I'll be going back to the castle soon, but I don't want to go back just yet." She deepened her voice and said quietly, "Thank you." Then she spun on her heels and started towards the shop, trying to keep calm. "Arya?" asked her brother, and she sighed quietly as she froze at the sound of her own name. "My name's Ari." "Ari the peasant boy," she snapped in her deeper voice. John laughed at the sound of it, and even she could barely choke back one of her own. "And what will Ned think if he finds out you've ran off again, Ari?" She sighed again, defeated. No point trying to hide it anymore. She pleaded with her half-brother, "Don't tell father, please." He mussed her messy hair playfully as he smiled and said, "Why would I tell father? You've been by me the entire time." She smiled at him, and turned her attention to the strange colors he was wearing. Normally, John had worn the same colors Rob and Bran did, even if her mother hated the idea of it, but here he was, standing in front of her in black on red. Everyone knew that he was going to be landed and that he had to get his own colors, words, sigil and even a name for his branch of the family, just like Bran would have to do if he couldn't get a place in the Kingsguard, just like she wished to have when she was older. But if he has his own colors, does that mean fathers gave him land? Have you finally chosen your colors? I think so, he answered with a smile, much kinder and more friendly than the ones Theon ever gave. There isn't another house in the north with them. Does that mean you're getting your land? You're leaving? He's my brother, I don't want him to go. Not yet. He laughed. Not yet. Not for a couple of years, anyway. Come on, we best get back to the castle before your mother gets too worried. She passed him back his coin and sighed again. She hoped to have maybe another hour or so outside before having to go back to the castle, a chance to explore her home some more, but now she would be coming back early enough that she might have to deal with lessons under Septa Mordane again, being forced to learn how to sew, how to dance and how to be ladylike, lessons that were as long and boring as they were pointless. She stayed silent for the entire walk back to the castle, but she never thought of trying to run off and go back into the city. Her brother had found her and the people around them had realized who she was because of it, but it was also the honorable thing to do and wouldn't embarrass either of them. Besides, I'll be outside again tomorrow after we break our fasts. Guards sighed at themselves as they passed, knowing how Jory and Roderick would drill them that little bit harder as they worked to come up with a plan that would stop her from leaving the castle quite as easily. Her constant adventures into the city had been helping them find weaknesses in the defenses, gaps in patrols, nooks and crannies that were never checked, passages that were thought to be secure and places where the field of view from the towers were just not quite wide enough to see her. Even during the days where she wasn't able to leave the castle, she worked on her plans that allowed her to. She looked at the towers and remembered which guards were where, listening in on their conversations when she could to know how focused they would be, whether they had been drinking the night before. She had never done anything that might have hurt someone, but she always worked hard to find a way out of the castle, so when she had the chance it was all the easier to get out. As her brother took her through the gatehouse, she smiled widely as she heard the Mormont woman shout out to her. "Your mother has been looking everywhere for you." The she-bear stood tall and proud as any man, and she smiled at Arya as she spoke with her brother. There was no one in the world Arya wanted to be more like than her. She wanted to hunt and ride and fight, just as she could. So sometimes she secretly practiced with her, learning how to shoot a bow for hunting and a crossbow for war, how to fight with sword, mace and shield, even learning how to ride a horse on the rarest of days. "I want to be just like her." She wore the same clothes and cut her hair the same way and was never far from her if she could help it. Daisy smiled at her brother, a teasing smile as she looked over him from head to heel, glancing at the black direwolf on red. "Is this the 6th Blackfyre rebellion?" John froze. Then he looked down at his clothes. Then with a blank face, he started walking towards the keep as Daisy began to laugh. "Come on, Arya, you need to change out of those. And have a bath, gods, girl, you smell like dust." Daisy reached out and wiped her hand across Arya's leather tunic, pulling away a hand covered in dust and grime. "Where did you go to get this much on you?" "I won't say, not even to her." "Exploring." Daisy laughed as they started walking towards the keep themselves. "Exploring, you say? You won't ever tell me how you left the castle, will you?" "I won't," she answered firmly. "Ever. Even from me. Don't worry, we've all got our own secrets. Only fair you have yours, too." The castle was busy as they began to hold court, but she wasn't there to watch, as Daisy led her through the back halls where she wouldn't be seen on her way back to her chambers. "Where did you go, anyway?" "The market," the she-bear asked as they started to go up the steps. "I went around most of the city, and spoke with a green man. He said the branches of fate were broken. Do you know what he meant?" Daisy shrugged. She was only 6 years or so older than Jon and a year older than Theon, strong and beautiful, too. The green men say a lot of things, but only some of it makes sense. If it's important, I think we'll figure it out before long, and if it's truly important, they would have told Ned. I guess you're right. She always listened to everything Daisy said, and it made sense. If it had been important, wouldn't the green man have told her father and not her? It's not like I can do anything about it, even if it was, but I'll tell him when I see him. She yawned as she climbed up the steps, then she asked, "Are you going to be taking me to the Septa? After you've been cleaned up?" "No. And I think we'll be going hunting tomorrow, with Robb and all the others." Arya grinned. She loved hunting, especially with her brothers riding alongside her. When they got to her room, Daisy found her some new, clean clothes. Then the two headed to one of the baths inside the castle keep, one exclusively for the women of the household, even if her mother thought it was a bad idea, since it certainly didn't fit to the Southron ideal of bathing, and the faith had tried to wipe out their method since they thought it made people wanton and ill. They wrong. It makes us as hard as rocks. Daisy opened the door to the first room, and Arya followed her in. It was a small room, with 4 square baths filled with icy cold water and with bins to hold piles of dirty clothes for the serving maids to collect later in the day, then another set of bins that held clean clothes for after bathing, and a door, on the opposite side that led to the bathhouse proper. She set the clothes Daisy chose for her down away from the cold waters, then started taking off her leathers and setting them aside before sliding herself into the icy cold water as naked as the day she had been born. The cold water chilled her to the bone, but she bit down on nothing and didn't make a sound as she slipped beneath it all, submerging her entire body beneath the surface before pushing herself out, just as Daisy did in the tub just past hers, who shook her long black hair and threw it over her shoulder. She looked to see if Arya was shivering and smiled when she saw she wasn't. Then they both walked to the door, the big, strong door on the far side that could barely hold in the great heat of the room on the other side. Steam drifted out through the gap beneath the door, filling her with a renewed energy as it rushed past her skin, as relaxing as a warm rain. But it was only the start, as she opened the door and stepped into the hot room. It was made entirely out of wood, with copper pipes flowing through the walls all around and only a small hole in the wall to vent smoke from the pile of burning charcoal in the center, surrounded by stone blocks like an oven. Wooden benches sat all around it, the closest ones to the center being unbearably hot in her opinion, while the ones closest to the wall were colder and meant for children. "I haven't flowered yet, but I'm not a child. I'm already big." Barrels of water sat around the room, alongside big wooden ladles for heaping it onto the coals to make steam. She sat in the middle row of the fiery room, letting the heat swallow her whole as it flowed over her, making her weary muscles tingle at its soft caress. She yawned again in the relaxing warmth, and Daisy simply said, "If you're tired, go to sleep. I'll wake you when it's time to go." She smiled at the woman who was her sister, her protective, strong sister, even if they weren't related by blood or marriage. She lay down, flat on her back, and let herself be carried into blissful rest. Asterisk 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 asterisk. End of part 4. Notes. Anyway, we see how Arya has been sneaking out of the castle, and she's definitely a clever girl, that's for sure. She's been going through the small gap between the interior wall that separates the rooms from the exterior wall, where the pipes flow. She's strong, too, from constantly climbing up and down those tunnels, grabbing onto the pipes and then descending, one at a time, through hot and cold. She looks up to Daisy Mormont, no question about it, and that's one of the reasons she is wilder in this universe than she is in canon. Catelyn is trying to rein her in, but the harder she tries the more Arya fights back. Ned, on the other hand, pretty much knows that he can never hope to control her, so is content to let her do what she wants within reason and so long as she stays safe. Arya has a lot of love for her father and her brothers, even Sansa too, but to say her relationship with Catelyn is strained is an understatement. She is going against everything Catelyn had been taught to expect of her daughters, and with neither Sansa or Arya being much like their mother, she's starting to feel like sunglasses. A fish out of water. She feels rather isolated, and we'll see more about that in her part, hence why she had hoped Arya would be more ladylike than her sister, which definitely didn't happen. Moving on, we also see the first Seastook since their mention in the original post. They are from the east coast and protect the narrow sea alongside the Mandaelis, just as the Darkstarks protect the Sunset Sea by helping the Mormonts. Keeping pirates at bay in the Narrow Sea is of major importance to the North, since the canal has redirected the flow of trade around the continent and made the North fairly dependent on open trade lanes with the free cities, so people like Salad Horsaran are on the North's hit list. And of course, the bathhouse inside Winterfell is a sauna. Or more accurately, it's a banya, the Russian variant. The North is certainly well suited for developing a sauna culture of their own, even in canon, since they have an abundance of fuel for them and they would certainly be a nice thing to have in that climate. I wouldn't think it was much of a leap for them to develop something like it on their own, especially with long winters. In our world, steam baths mostly fell out of favor on the continent as the church really did think they made people lustful, which they might well have done, considering many of them were mixed gender, but the North certainly doesn't have that problem. And in reality, many women did give birth in the banya, because they had a lower chance of catching an infection in the process. Though they didn't know why. The soot and smoke are a natural disinfectant, making the room a nearly sterile environment. Hell, even the Russian nobility took this stuff into account when giving birth. From my research, a lot of people hit themselves on the back with birch branches and the like, to improve circulation, obviously not as hard as Torren hit his brother, though. And we see a closer look at Winterfell itself. The castle walls have spells woven into them, just like at Storm's End, but whether or not they do anything is a mystery. The entire castle has been extensively fortified and expanded in some areas, mostly to ensure that the visiting lords and ladies, people like the Karstark brothers and their sister, have a room to stay that is fitting their status in the North. Places like the First Keep have been restored and expanded, while other rooms have been built to provide amenities, etc. The city is also well built, and of course, we have that shop with the glass front, which like CDA pointed out is a bit of an anomaly, since it loses heat through the glass. Then we see the Snowcloaks, the city watch for Winterfell. They don't need as many men to patrol the same amount of space as a Southern city, since the eagles in the sky might as well be UAVs from our own world. The warg inside can see everything going on below, so when he or she sees a crime going on, they can simply watch and report it to their superiors, watch the person move around and then take control of an animal like a bear to alert a guard squad and lead them to the lawbreaker. For a lack of better words, this means the city watch might as well be everywhere in the city at once. Then Arya meets a green man. I think that part speaks for itself. The technique he used for the tree is real and an efficient way of growing new trees quickly. It's a pretty simple process, so I'd consider it safe that they'd know about it. Chapter 5, Catelyn I. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Catelyn watched her youngest child play with his wooden blocks, raising one on top of another as he built a tiny castle that she knew was meant to be Winterfell, even if it looked nothing like it. He had his wild moments, times where no one could keep him in check, not even his father, but that was normal for a boy his age, even one born south of the neck. I pray he settles soon. Arya had been just the same, but she never stopped. She sighed. Her girls went against everything she had been taught was the right way for a lady to act, everything she had been taught herself. Sansa was beautiful, but strong-willed, never afraid to tell people when she thought they were wrong or whenever they wanted her to do something she didn't want to do. Arya, she was her aunt made small. Her husband told her she was going to be one of the great beauties of the realm when she came of age, but was as wild as fire and utterly uncontrollable. Only an hour ago had Catelyn tried to get her youngest daughter to go to the Septa, to learn more about the ways of being a lady, but she had vanished out of her chamber without a trace, even though there was a guard watching the door. It was as though she could walk through walls. We have so little in common. My girls, they're not like me, they never will be. My sons won't be knights, my daughters won't be ladies. Was it too much to expect for her children to have things in common with her? True, Robb, Sansa, Brandon and Rickon had her auburn hair and her blue eyes, but they were northern to the core, without a drop of the south in the way they acted. Sansa had struck her bastard brother when he had embarrassed her before, and rather than apologizing they had both simply laughed it off as if it had never happened at all, and she was the child of hers who was closest to the south. None of her children were like her, none of them kept the seven, none of them were interested in the South or the Southern way of doing things and try as she might to shape them so that they might have a few things in common with her and the South, none of them had changed. They all looked to their father and her beloved husband for guidance, even the girls. Had she done something wrong? All she had ever wanted was a peaceful family and she had created it, but she didn't feel like a part of it. How could she? I'm alone. I'm surrounded by my family and my husband, but I am alone. A part of her craved the walls of home, her true home. Riverrun. It was so far away from her, so far from the north and its snow-covered cities. She missed its rivers, its sandstone walls, and the friends and family she had there. Lysa, her sweet and innocent little sister, her stern but loving father, her understanding uncle, even cunning Petter. But they were lost to her now, lost like tears in the rain. Lysa was married to Jon Arryn, Lord Paramount of the Vale. Brynden had followed her, Edmure was with her father in the Riverlands and Petter had become master of Coin. She missed them all dearly, and remembered the day she met the man who had become her husband. He wasn't as big or as handsome as his elder brother Brandon, but he had the purest heart she had ever seen in a man, kind and loving, never hard to her. She had known for years before then that she was to marry the heir to Winterfell. Her father had arranged the betrothal for whatever reason, he had never told her why, so when the handsome heir to Winterfell, Brandon Stark, came to Riverrun curious of his betrothed, she met him with just as much curiosity in return. Every lord and lady learned the sigils of all the great houses of the Seven Kingdoms, so the grey direwolf of the Starks was already familiar to her, but the cadet branches that had accompanied him, as curious as he of his bride-to-be and of the South, were less so. She knew them, yes, she had been taught by her maester and the Septa to recognize them even when she was little, but to see the banners fluttering in the air and not in the pages of a book was a different thing altogether. The reality of it had sunk in, then, the realization of it all. Brandon had been sweet, but forceful, aggressive and strong, used to having his own way in life and in the bedchamber. She knew now she would have never found love had she married him, she would have gone utterly mad and she loved the man she had married. Hoster had heard tales of the cities of the north, winterscapes covered in snow that stretched as far as the eye could see and great lakes filled with fish in summer that froze as hard as iron in winter, blocks of ice rising from the surface and cracking at the top like shards of broken glass and where it snowed even in summer. Everyone in the south knew that the amount of gold dragons the north sent to the Iron Throne had been steadily increasing, and everyone knew about the canal, built only a few centuries before that had robbed the Dornish of their wealth and brought the lion, the rose and the wolf closer together. It was common knowledge that if the Lannisters, the Tyrells and the Starks worked together, they had enough men to overrun the rest of the Seven Kingdoms combined, with enough ships to challenge the free cities for control of the waves. They had been close friends before the war, with the canal bringing all three of them closer together, so much so that Tytos Lannister had wed his daughter Jenna to Bern Darkstark. But many in the south thought the canal had been built millennia ago by Brandon the Builder and that the Starks had simply stumbled upon it and got it working again. They thought that the cities of the north were decrepit, filled with wooden shacks with thatched roofs and musty timbers, that the north was and would never be a threat to Southron supremacy. How could it be, if they only sent forth a few thousand men during the Dance of Dragons or the Blackfyre Rebellion? Her father had heard both sides, and listened to merchants who had sailed to the northern cities of White Harbor and Darkport and told him that the cities were as they were elsewhere in the Seven Kingdoms. The streets were tiled with cobblestones, the guards patrolled dutifully, houses were built a little larger for when kin came in winter and the northern shipyards were busy producing warships and merchant cogs. But listening to their stories could only take him so far, so he had sent her uncle Brynden to the north with Brandon to learn the truth, under the guise of finding her a dower. He returned with the truth a few weeks later, delayed by a snow near Moat Cailin. He told her and her father that the north was as they said. Once one went past the swamps of the Neck, where the Crannog men harvested tar for shipbuilding, pitch for burning and salt for cooking, one entered another world, where only a handful worshipped the Seven, a land where there were no knights but where the castles reached high into the sky, where space was no obstacle to building wide and tall. He told her how the people of the north bathed every day they could inside their hot baths, after drilling in the courtyards or after sewing in their ballrooms. Sometimes the men and women of the north would even bathe together, lashing themselves on the back with sticks and branches for relaxation. Skin changers practiced their arts openly, not by turning into animals but by taking control of them, slipping inside their skins the way she might change dresses. They had armies as finely trained and equipped as any in the south, even if they had different ideas of how they were meant to fight in battle. Then he told her of Winterfell, the place she would spend the rest of her days once she was wed. The castle had seemed so much bigger when he told her of it, of the runes woven into the walls, of the pipes that flowed inside the bricks and the scores of servants who worked there to provide for the dozens of high-born men and women who lived there alongside the Starks. They were wards from the great houses of the north, sent to Winterfell to grow alongside the children of the Stark family and to earn the friendship of the ancient house, then to speak on the behalf of their families whenever the Lord of Winterfell held court. They were even there to be with those who they might one day marry, a place where the lords and ladies of the north could speak with one another on casual terms and learn more about one another, making marriages in the north easy, though many of the women certainly tried to win the hand of the Stark heir, just as many of the men were certainly interested in Lyanna. Then he told her about the cadet branches. Half of them were from bastards, like the Snowsturks, who were descended from the bastard son that the king in the north had begotten on a wilderling woman. A few traced their lines back to warrior women, and others still came from second sons. The idea of landing so many bastards unnerved her, especially when she learnt of how the Greystocks once tried to usurp their cousins in Winterfell only to be beaten into submission, stripped of their original seat and landed east of where they once were. Had the Starks not learned that landing bastards was a dangerous thing? Didn't they learn anything from the Blackfyre Rebellion? To favor a bastard enough to give them land was to make the realm bleed, as had happened a dozen times before. And yet, as Brynden told her, Brandon was surrounded by those people who should have been plotting to take his inheritance from him, but they were like brothers, so much so that half of them followed him to the grave after going to King's Landing at his side. Then I married Ned, and I did my duty. I gave him a son, and he returned to me with a son of his own. She didn't care that he had been unfaithful to her in the rebellion. Every wife knew that sometimes their husbands might need the comfort that only a woman could provide on the eve of battle. She didn't care that he had sired a child on her, but she was horrified that he had brought that child into her home, to grow alongside their true-born children as a brother, then promising to give that bastard son land when he came of age, a noble title, and even offering to arrange a good marriage for him. She could forgive him for anything else, easily. But she could never forgive him for that, never, not in 1,000 years, so she stayed away from the bastard, trying to avoid the feeling that rose in the back of her throat whenever she saw him. Every fiber of her being told her that he had committed a horrible mistake bringing him under the roof of Winterfell. Would he not come to envy his brother, to dream of having Winterfell for his own, just as the Greystocks had all those years ago? What if he was to ally with an enemy outside the north for the chance to take his brother's right? What if? Had he been born a girl, I would have never minded. I would have been a mother to her and loved her, but as a boy, he's a threat to my children. But, nowadays, it seemed the only thing her husband's bastard was interested in stealing from her son was his dessert, not his inheritance. She had tried to separate the two, but it simply couldn't be done, like trying to undo a mixing of water and dye. She had tried all the same, but all it had done was distance her even further from the children she tried to protect. Being a mother had sounded so simple in her Septa's lessons all those years ago, but it had become so much more complex than she had ever expected. The old, wizened Septa told her that her children could be controlled, and that she should try and steer them towards what she wanted them to do, but it had never worked. She prayed to the crone to light her way, to teach her some way of making her children the way they were meant to be, to show them how they are meant to act in the world, but again, it had never worked. She was at a loss on how to deal with them, now. When she had Sansa she had hoped that she would have been someone like her, someone Catelyn could talk to and be more than just mother and daughter, but friends, too, but it hadn't been. She had hoped the same for Arya, too, praying to the mother and the maiden that she would be more of a lady than her sister, but the gods seemed to have a sense of irony and they made her even less of a lady than her sister. Bran had dreamed of being a knight. He even kept the 7 so that he could pray to the warrior as the Kingsguard did, and she only encouraged him and loved him for it, and then he learned that he could walk into animals, and though he never lost the dream of becoming a member of the Kingsguard, they started to drift apart after he stopped worshipping the 7 since he knew what they thought of people who had that ability. She sighed again. Rickon climbed over his little walls and picked up a small wooden pyramid and placed it on top of the keep, standing on his tiptoes to get it onto the tall building. He grinned widely and pointed at his wooden castle with excitement. "Mama! Look," he spoke cheerfully, lifting her sad and weary heart. She smiled at her youngest as she said, "It's wonderful. When I grow up, I want to be a builder." He said he wanted to be a direwolf last week. Ah. She loved her children dearly, all of them, but it saddened her that she had so little in common with them. Rukan was still very young, and though she had only weaned him a little after his second birthday, as was proper, he was still a baby, even if he had his wild moments. She hoisted him up into her arms, into a hug she so rarely got. "You'll be just like Brandon the Builder, and you will raise big castles." He grinned as he planted his face against her shoulder. "Can we see Dada?" she heard as little more than a murmur. She smiled again. He nestled close against her as she started walking towards the door. "We'll see, we can't interrupt him if he's in court." Rukan nodded sleepily, so she took a little walk around the room in a circle, and then he was fast asleep. If he was more awake, I would have taken him. She walked over to his bed, a much smaller one than a full one, but bigger than the cradle he used to sleep in, and pulled back the covers before gently placing him on it and rolling the blanket back up to keep him warm. Finally, she gave him a kiss on the cheek before leaving him to rest. She was closer to her children than many mothers normally were, but that only made her all the more sadder when they finally grew apart. She wanted to be closer to them, she really did, but she didn't know how. Nothing she had been taught in the South worked on them, so maybe I need to try a different way. She started piecing together an idea as she left Rukan to sleep and headed towards her own chambers. She and Ned shared a bed every night, even if they weren't being intimate with one another, but she had her own room all the same, directly besides his with a doorway connecting them together. It was a warm place, one that she had decorated like her old one at Riverrun, even though she knew she would never return to her original chamber, her original home. Ned had built a September for her inside the courtyard, but going there by herself, without any of her family around her, she couldn't bear to do it. That was something only a woman who had outlived the rest of her family should do, as even maidens went with their mothers and sisters. When Sangza gave her a gift for the Mother's Day, she had been utterly stunned that she knew, and she took it gladly, only to weep in her chamber afterwards. Her children were so close to her in Winterfell, but so far away. She climbed up through the steps to the floor her chamber was on in silence, thinking. The harder she tried to steer her children, the harder they fought back and the more distant they became, so, what if she tried the opposite? What if she stopped trying to control them entirely, but instead tried to encourage them to do what they loved the most? Or was that being too reckless? Arya sneaks into the city whenever she can, even without guards. If she was to do that in a southern city, like King's Landing, gods, it doesn't bear thinking about. She sighed again as she stepped into her room. It was well decorated and her husband had certainly spared no expense on making her feel welcome in Winterfell, and for that, she was truly grateful. She was truly a fish out of water here, so far from what she knew to be the norm and was raised in. Nothing she had been taught in the South could have ever prepared her for life in the North, not even what Brynden told her so many years ago. She sat down in her favorite chair to think, and then there was a sudden knock at the door. "Come in," she said loud enough to be heard through the door. After a moment's pause, the young lady Lyanne Darkstark stepped inside, one of the few girls in Winterfell who wanted her advice. She was a shy thing, the spitting image of her wanton sister aside from the orange ribbon she wore in her hair, gentle and innocent. "If Arya is her aunt made small, then Lyanne is my sister." She smiled fondly at the young maiden, a girl who reminded her so much of her little sister and was one of the few people she could call a friend in Winterfell. "Lady Stark, can we talk?" she asked carefully. Of course, she gestured to a chair beside her with a smile. "What do you want to talk about?" "I'm worried, it's about my sister." Lyanne sighed as she walked across the room and sat in the chair. "And?" She blushed a bright shade of red. "Boys." Catelyn almost laughed. Lysa had said almost the exact same thing years ago, looking to Catelyn for advice when she still wasn't sure herself. "There's no reason to be afraid of them, Lyanne. It's not that. People are getting me and my sister confused. She likes to take men to her bed often, and I don't, but people get us mixed up because we look the same." Catelyn never lost her smile as Lyanne spoke. She was like a daughter to her, a daughter she knew and could understand, so she was always happy to have her around. Indeed, she had started following Catelyn to the September, something that made it a little easier for her to go there at all. "I'm worried someone she might bed might think I am her and do something untowards." I'm worried she might never find a husband, too, since she's already been taken, and how do I know if I like someone? She's at the age. Lion, Caitlin said, watching Lion look straight towards her and relax a little at the sound of her voice. You look like your sister, but you don't have to wear the same as her. Try wearing something different, it will make you stand apart from her. Lion sighed. We don't have different clothes. We both have the same colors, and wear the same size and have the same styling. They both wear northern fashions, but if Lion was to wear clothes the way they do in the south, no one would ever mistake them again. I have a few ideas, but I will need to speak with a dressmaker first. Lion nodded. I hope they help. Theon thought I was my sister and... She went quiet, obviously uncomfortable talking about it, and simply seeing her like that made Caitlin hate the squid even more than she already did. He is nothing but trouble. It had taken her years to settle into Winterfell, even if it wasn't as familiar to her as Riverrun. She had latched onto her husband and let him tell her all about the North, all about the lords and ladies and the culture and the things they did together. Then she had started working out the wards, whether they be men or women. They might argue amongst themselves, or even fight one another, but the Greyjoy, they hated him more than anything. She had seen a friendly brawl between Donal Snowstock and the small Genova who was stronger break up the moment Theon came into view, and like bricks in a wall, her son and his friends put aside any differences they had to focus on him alone. Oh, they had started off friendly enough when the Greyjoy boy had been brought to Winterfell after his father's fruitless rebellion. Robb had been eager to get another friend, but then the boy offended the bastard, and turned all the wolves of Winterfell against him. Things had only gotten worse for him since then, so nowadays he spent most of his time drinking and whoring in the city, then returning to the castle so deep in his cups he had once collapsed beneath the gatehouse. It had made him few friends and countless enemies, so much so that she was sure if he hadn't been under her husband's protection as his ward he would have died long ago, maybe while trying to fight against the city watch, or ran through by one of the guards whose wife he had slept with. He had never even tried to make amends since then, whether because of his own stubborn nature or because of his damned pride, but even then she doubted that Robb or Jon would have ever accepted it, and now he had done something wrong to Lion, a girl she loved as much as either of her daughters. What did he do, she asked. If he tried to force himself on her, not even the Seven would be able to save him. Lion sighed as she gathered the strength to say as quickly as she could, he grabbed my rump. If he does anything again, tell my husband. The shy girl nodded in understanding. She wouldn't be young forever, Caitlin knew, and eventually she would have to marry, to face her worst fear, but she saw no reason to make her put up with it before then, before she was ready. To put the young lady at ease, she changed the topic away from men entirely and asked, "What can you tell me about my daughter, Sansa?" "They're friends, so maybe I can learn something." "Sansa is a great friend. She's strong, never afraid to say what she thinks, but she tries to be friendly, and looks after everyone if she can. She's like you." Caitlin blinked in confusion. How was Sansa like her, when she seemed so different? Me? How? Lion smiled at Caitlin fondly. "You're both strong, kind, proud, and you both try to protect everyone around you." Her mind began to race. Were they really so alike? Sansa slapped her bastard brother. That isn't very lady. An old memory came back to her, from a time before she had even flowered, when she and Lysa were playing kissing games with Petter. He had been more direct with Lysa, who let him use his tongue, and when he tried the same with Caitlin she had slapped him so hard in her embarrassment that she had left a red print on his face, and then they laughed at it afterwards. The realization of it all, that Sansa was just like her except in northern furs, struck her as hard as she had struck him. Seven hells, cheese me. Just as Caitlin would do anything to protect her children, was there nothing that Sansa would not do to protect her friends? Were either of them all that willing to change, unless they had no choice but to? Both of them could be stubborn at times, and both of them always tried to be polite even if they didn't want to be. She sighed. "Lion, would you excuse me for a moment?" She nodded happily. "I'll be here till you get back." Caitlin rose from her seat and walked out the room. There was only one person in the world who found a way to control her when she was a girl. She headed up the steps, to where Maester Lewin kept the rookery. They were exceptional with children, even if they had none of their own, and she had turned to them whenever she had problems at Riverrun. All her siblings had, even Petter. "Uncle Brindon, you're my only hope. If there is anyone who can help me with my children, it's you." Asterisk 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 asterisk. End of part 5. Notes. So, where to start? Well, one of the reasons Caitlin is having so much trouble with Sansa is because she's a northern version of Caitlin. Caitlin's stubbornness in trying to make Sansa more southern, more ladylike, is reflected in her own stubbornness in that she won't change, not even for her mother. They both look after friends and family first and foremost, and they are both strong women. They are so similar that she never realized it till Lyon told her just how similar they are, though there are some differences that I'm sure you've noticed. And speaking of Caitlin, though she might not have realized it, there is certainly a bit of the North in her, even if she hasn't realized that it's there. But her biggest problem is her relationship with her children. She loves them, sure, but they are distant simply because she has so little shared interests with them. Rickon is in that sweet part where he's young enough that he still needs his mother, but when he grows up he won't need her anymore, and they'll start drifting apart since they have so little in common. Hence the part about being a fish out of water. She's alone in that she has little in common with them, even though she actually has a lot in common with Sansa, but she has never actually realized it before. One of the things that have kinda stopped her from adapting as much as she could have is how she has latched on to things that are more familiar to her, like decorating her room to be more like the one she had at Riverrun, and then loving Lyon like a daughter, simply because she's like a much younger Lysa. God, that's nightmarishly hard to explain. So, she's bringing in a person who is extremely good with children, the Blackfish of course. That's stuff for another time and another part. We'll see a lot more about her feelings towards Jon and the bastard branches of the Stark line then, but that's a while away yet. Moving on, the canal has been a large driving force behind Northern power, but it has also affected relations with the other parts of the Seven Kingdoms. The Lannisters and the Tyrells benefit greatly, and so they had pretty good relations till Robert's Rebellion, where things promptly went bad after Tywin sacked King's Landing. In this timeline, instead of Jenna being married to a Free, she was married to a Darkstalk, since there are certainly a lot of benefits involved in getting good relations with one of the naval powers in your neighborhood. She's the mother of Adra and Lyon, and if I knew what software CDA used for his family trees, I'd hammer out one for each of the cadet branches. And not every part of the North has benefited from Highland cattle, but they might have benefited indirectly. The Neck, for instance, is still swampland, but they are thus the North's chief supplier of tar, which is essential for ship construction. Oh, and Caitlin is still suspicious of Jon, even if she's starting to realize he isn't planning on doing any kinslaying anytime soon. Next part, Bran. And no swapping this time. Chapter 6, Bran I. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Bran peered down from his eagle, watching the people go about their lives as he soared above the city, knowing his own body was being carefully watched and protected inside the room just above the guard quarters. He felt the cold winds blowing past his wings, the rising warmth coming from the chimneys of the houses below, and heard the sounds of the people, too. He could see 4 miles around, flying above even the highest towers of Winterfell with a view that was known only by skin changers and once, the dragon lords of the old freehold. He looked down upon the twists and turns of the streets, watching people go about their daily lives as they always did, whether he was up there watching or not. He wasn't the only warg in the skies, there were a few dozen, leaving no part of the city streets uncovered, ensuring that every crime that took place on the city streets, every theft, every drunken brawl and every pickpocketing was seen and dealt with. Like people speaking through water, he heard some of the other wargs leave their birds and go down the steps to where idle squads of guardsmen gathered, telling them what had happened and where, then taking control of another animal to lead them and point people out. But he soared higher than any of them, uninterested in watching single people, but the city as a whole. When a warg broke an animal, any of them could take it, so there was never a moment that the city wasn't being watched, as the eagles that the City Watch used were owned by the Watch, not by any one man or woman. But his bird, Goldwing, it was his, well and truly. He was a strong golden eagle, from the Vale, with a wingspan of 7 feet, a giant even amongst his own kind, with talons like daggers and a beak that could crush the skull of a raven with ease. Male golden eagles were usually smaller than the females, but that only made Goldwing all the more unique amongst the eagles of the Snowcloaks and the wild ones that hunted the mice and rats of the snowy city. The King's Guard have never had a walk before. I'll be the first. He felt the little niggling of the bird in his mind, desiring to take back control, if only for a little while, so that he could find something to eat, so he let it take over again, looking through its eyes as it tipped its wings high and dove towards the ground. There was little difference between his own wants and the bird's, now. He could feel its hunger, just as it could feel his, and once he had been heading to the kitchens of Winterfell in search of something to eat when the bird swooped towards him with a roll of white bread in his claws, still warm from wherever it had snatched it. Goldwing knows I should only have cooked food, he never brings me anything raw, the only problem is when I think of clothes and he rips them apart when he tries to get them for me. His mother had been horrified when she had learned that he was a warg, not as scared as the Septon had been, but slowly she had come to learn that not all skin changers were bad, most of them were just common folk who had been born with the power to assert their will over animals. They were just another part of life in the north, now, working for lords as trackers and scouts, for the Night's Watch as rangers, or as watchmen. Even the Seastooks have people like me on their ships, that way they can find out where they are at sea. He felt and heard the wind screaming past him as Goldwing shot towards the city, faceless crowds of people and featureless buildings growing more detailed as he got closer and closer, throwing his wings outwards and darting not even a dozen feet above the rooftops, looking around constantly in search of prey. He had taught the bird well, not just by flying in his body, but by hunting with him, too, taking him into the woods and fields of the north to hunt rabbits, foxes and deer. Even wolves could fall before it, but he tried to avoid those when he could. It wasn't right to hunt what was kin to the direwolf, at least in his opinion. He flew in his bird often, but merely spending time with it was still great fun, especially with how close they were. He had learned how to let the bird take control, but how to stay with it so that he could see through its eyes, but also how to take full control when he wanted. Goldwing glanced left and saw a small child covered in dirt running as fast as they could from a feral dog's jaws in the back streets of the city. He had managed to teach Goldwing something that no falconer would have ever been able to teach, whether they came from south of the neck or north of it. How to tell the difference between right and wrong. When a warg was in the skin of an animal they influenced it, causing them to take on their traits and pick up their habits, even if they were being influenced ever so slightly in return. His eagle had learned from him and his way of thinking, and it had only changed Goldwing for the better, even seeming to give the bird a sense of honor, even if it was a simple one. It never went near the eggs of other birds, even if they were prey, leaving their nests as safe areas and even ignoring their mothers and fathers as they brought meals back to their hatchlings. He had even watched it protect the nest of a snow shrike from another golden eagle that had thought to make a meal out of the young birds inside, too young to fly on their own and utterly defenseless. Goldwing had easily driven off the smaller eagle, then watched the nest from afar to ensure it didn't come back till the fully grown shrikes returned. The bird knew his dream of being a true knight, like Sir Barristan the Bold, Sir Gerald the White Bull and Sir Arthur Dane, a dream that his mother had encouraged with all her heart. The eagle had learnt it all. He acts like a hero would, now. Goldwing veered about in a swift, fluid motion and darted towards the dog in deathly silence as the child screamed and cried. The mongrel's eyes went wide in sudden realization, but it was far too late. Goldwing round beak first, directly into the dog's head and right between the eyes, like the strike of a knight's lance hitting true. There was a loud and pained yelp as blood began to pour from the wound, but Goldwing shot back into the sky and dove down again, sinking a talon into the soft flesh on the back to anchor itself before using the other to rake along the side, cutting deep, through the fur and skin and into the muscle and scratching the bone deep inside. Then it ripped along the side, like tearing cloth, from the dog's left hind leg all the way to the throat in a single smooth and brutal cleave, nicking an artery, or several, that only added to the pour of blood that killed the feral dog long before it ever had a chance to fight back. It crashed to the ground as Goldwing continued the onslaught, going for the eyes with his beak and tearing them out one after the other with a wet squelch. Bran felt them pop in his mouth, like crushing a hot-boiled egg beneath his teeth. The golden eagle began to feast, the rich metallic smell and taste of hot, steaming blood hitting him hard and quick, with a definition that his human senses would have never caught, a taste that made his human body sick. Enough. He let go of Goldwing's body, and was in his own once again, nestled safe and sound inside the guard quarters, where the captain of the wargs, Donal Fourwings, waited with an hourglass tipped upside down, the sand halfway to the bottom. He was the son of a smith and his mother had been a milkmaid and he couldn't read or write, but he was one of the most powerful wargs south of the wall and had 4 birds at his command, though none of them were as great as Bran's eagle. I heard Theon call him Donal Foreskins, but mother says I shouldn't ever call him that. Donal commanded the wargs that were part of the Snowcloaks, whether they were men or women, watching over them with his hourglass to make sure that they took a break every once in a while, to tend to the needs of their human bodies and to stop them from being in their other skins for too long. Even the greatest warg could lose sight of their humanity if they stayed inside the skin of an animal for too long, which was one of the main reasons why his mother was afraid of him wearing the wings of his eagle. He was the most experienced warg in the watch, having joined over 30 years ago at the same age as Bran, but since then he had only grown more experienced in controlling his creatures, more proficient at slipping in and out quickly and better at dominating them whenever he had to. John says he's in all his birds at once, but I don't know. It was rare for a practicing warg like him to die of old age. Most of them either went mad when they lost an animal, or became so inseparable from their skins that they might as well have been mad, as there was so much of the beast in them that they became not quite human. That's why he has the hourglass. He stops people when it runs out, so they aren't out of their bodies too long. All around him were other wargs, sat on the floor or on wooden benches, men and women dressed in blue and white, looking towards the floor with eyes as pale as milk. A fire crackled in the hearth on the far side besides the thick door of solid oak, reinforced with steel braces to keep the Snowcloak's most valuable weapons safe. There were wargs in all parts of the north, from the neck to the wall, and some even went across the narrow sea in search of employment as trackers for hire, or assassins in some cases if the rumors were true. Most of them stayed in the north, as the faith despised them and the Andals were suspicious, so few of them ever thought to go south and even fewer actually did. But there was no such issue about visiting the free cities and signing up with the mercenary companies, who paid well for the talents that only a warg could bring to war. Even the Golden Company had a group, so few that they could be counted on one hand, people thirsty for wealth, fame and adventure, but they were far more dangerous than their small number might indicate, as they controlled elephant bulls, clad in steel plate heavier than anything a knight might carry and given the mind of a man that made them cunning and able to tell friend from foe. The power of such a war animal was second only to the dragons, and dragons were gone from the world. The Golden Company had only a dozen of them and even less wargs to control them with, but without the weight of a litter on the back they were deadly, the pride of the Golden Company's battle line. He rose from his position of the floor, wincing openly as the taste of blood faded from his mouth. Donal spoke quietly to avoid distracting the wargs, but smiled, "Your eagle having a hot supper?" Brandon nodded slowly and replied as quietly as Donal. "A dog. You get used to the taste after a while, but you'll never like it." Donal glanced at the hourglass, careful not to knock it and the sands flowing inside. "Still got half an hour left if you get a drink and wash it out." "No," he answered, half tempted to lick his sleeves to drive the taste from his mouth. "I think I'm done for the day." Donal nodded. "You'll be a powerful warg one day, if you keep practicing like you are." He sighed and warned, "Just don't spend too long in the bird. You'll lose your wits if you do." He nodded obediently and without even a thought of complaint. Everyone knew what happened to those who spent too long in their skins, the wargs who walked the world with their eyes forever turned skyward and a lust for wings of their own. There were rules for wargs like him, intended to protect them and those around from any harm that might result from being in the skin of an animal. But there were laws, too, for crimes that had been utterly unimaginable barely a century or two ago, and were still unknown south of the neck. Every animal that has been taken has to be marked, whether by something as simple as drawing a pattern onto their fur or hide with a piece of charcoal, to the tiny rings of polished steel he had around the legs of Goldwing, just above the talons and easily visible. They gleamed in the light and had the direwolf of his house stamped onto them, showing that the bird was his. Most of the wargs in the city worked for the Snowcloaks, or for his father. There were never a lack of well-paying jobs for even a weak warg, so there was never a risk of having his bird stolen from him, but the Snowcloaks usually claimed some of the stray animals in the city for their own use. The rings mean they can tell at a glance that he's mine. One of the most important rules for a warg is that they cannot be in the skin of their creature while it was enjoying the company of another animal, at least, that's what his mother and Donal said. He wasn't so sure about that one, though. What was wrong about being in Goldwing while it was playing games with another eagle? "I play games with Arya and Rob and all the others," There's nothing wrong with that, and we even played fetch with Goldwing, but I'm not allowed to play games while in him. That is so unfair. Other than that, many of their rules were common sense, like not eating the flesh of man while in their other skins, though why anyone would want to do such a thing was well beyond confusing. He walked towards the door as quietly as he could to avoid breaking the concentration of those around him, then opened it as little as he could before slipping past it and into the hall. The main quarters of the Snowcloaks, sometimes called the Snow Keep, was a simple building of 2 floors, the first from stone blocks and the second was made from wood, since it had been added later as the city expanded. He was on the 2nd floor, and in front of him was a balcony that gave a good view of the entryway, with the only stairs up and down being through the stairwell on the left, which rose to a lookout tower above. Past that was the armory, packed to the brim with weapons and armor, some of it being handed down from the men-at-arms but most of it being made specifically for the Snowcloaks. Then on the other side, there was the door that led to the chambers of the experienced guard sergeants and other officers, those few in the watch who had the authority to pass sentencing on behalf of his father. Between him and that door were a few more, the offices of the captain of the wards and the captain of the city watch, the quartermaster and a few more. Everywhere he looked there were people going about their day and keeping the watch running as smoothly as the gears of a water mill. He walked left to the stairs, looking around for familiar faces as he did. Their weapons and armor aren't as good as the guardsmen of Winterfell, and they are not as well trained, but they are just as brave. He smiled at them all fondly as he went down the steps. A lot of the faces were familiar to him, as many in the Snowcloaks had kin working as guardsmen in the castle, with some even having brothers or sons in his father's household guard. He was careful to avoid slipping on the steps, but that didn't stop him from running down them, past a few laughing guards and to the bottom and onto the ground floor. His feet echoed as he leapt off the bottom step and onto the stone floor, but he already knew there was another floor underneath the Snow Keep, where the prisoners were held till they went to the wall, or until they were sentenced to whatever fate they had brought upon themselves. The offer of taking the Black was always given and always available for any who broke the laws of the North, with some even choosing to join the Black Brothers as they were pushed onto the chopping block, but many chose to go to the wall. They don't want to become a burden on their family, so they take the Black instead. Thousands of years ago, when the North wasn't whole and nowhere near as powerful as it is today, during the worst winters imaginable, it wasn't uncommon for the greybeards, the crippled and the weak to go hunting for their families, walking out into the snowstorms to die, so that there was more food for those who stayed behind. The need for such a sacrifice had died with the passage of time, but even now no one was willing to weigh down their family when the white winds blow and the day grows short. Even people crippled in accidents tried to find something that they could do to help, a way to earn their keep, so when healthy men broke the law, it was only natural that most of them would take the Black. I would rather die than be crippled. I would never join the Kingsguard, or do anything I want to do. He had been warned by a green man before about climbing the towers of Winterfell, how he would be crippled if he so much as lost his grip upon the stones, but that was only one more reason why he chose not to climb them, ever. Why do I need to climb them, when I can fly over them? But, like every Northman, he took the words of the green men to heart, promising to never climb the towers of Winterfell ever again, or any towers for that matter if he could avoid it. How many towers will I have to climb as a White Cloak, anyway? Stepping into the lobby, the downstairs was much the same as the upstairs, with the doors in more or less the same places, but it was better lit, with wider doors and all of them were more sturdily built than the ones upstairs. It was busier, too, and the door to the outside threw open as a group of guardsmen stepped inside, trailed by a brown bear, holding a thief who simply didn't have the strength to even begin to struggle against the animal holding him. I swear, I don't know how the ring got in my pocket, yelled the man in the bear's grasp. Tell it to someone who cares. We watched you do it, answered a guard sergeant with disinterest. The Black or a hand? The thieving man sighed, his guilt truly obvious now. The Black, he muttered weakly. I'll take the Black. The bear dropped him onto the floor with a soft thump. Then, it patted him on the back twice before dropping onto all fours and walking outside again. Brandon followed the bear out, into the cold day, where Goldwing was already waiting, perched upon the roof of a nearby building. He smiled at his eagle. He hadn't even finished growing, but he was already so powerful. Patches of white still dotted him, especially along his tail feathers, but his wings were brown and a very pale gold at the edges. His talons and beak dripped a steaming red, but Goldwing had already cleaned his body as best as he could, knowing that a knight should be as cleanly as possible. I don't keep the 7 anymore. They don't like people like me. But I don't have to keep their gods to be a knight. Ser Jorah keeps the old gods, like we do, and he's a knight, and there are others, too. Not many, but I don't think I have to be a knight to be in the Kingsguard. He raised his sword hand for the bird, and as it dove towards him, he thought of the last time he went to the September. It wasn't a small one or poorly built, it had statues of the 7 made from chiseled granite, but so few people went there that he was sure his mother, his sister and he were the only ones who went, even though there was room for 100 inside the walls. It had beautiful panes of stained glass brought from Myr and Braavos across the narrow sea, holy texts written in Old Town by the Brothers of the Starry September, and had a septon who had no lack of piety or fervor, but had a lack of anyone interested in his preaching. There had once been a group of people, a dozen or so at most, who had been curious about the 7, going there whenever the bells tolled, but it had been whittled away, with fewer people showing up to the septon's sermons year after year. Now, the only company the septon had were the septars, bottles of drink and the 7, but Bran was sure that he lost his faith long ago. We don't like their gods and they don't like us very much. The septon said my skin changing was sorcery, so I stopped going. The septon had once even tried to say that so many of the Stark heroes old Nan had told him about, seen in the crypts and in the streets, had been blessed by the 7, but that was utter nonsense. Half of them had never even heard of the 7, yet alone worshipped them. Brandon the Builder was around before there were Andals, so how could he have been favored by the smith? The roots of the old gods ran as deep as those of their heart trees, and he knew that no septon would ever be able to uproot them in the north. The Mandaelis were the only house in the north, great or small, to worship the 7, and Wyler kept the old gods, not the new, even if it was only to fit in with the ladies around her. The Green Men might have been a common sight in the north, but they visited all the 7 kingdoms, tending to the woods as far away as the mountains of Dorne near Starfall, while others had gone into the depths of the Vale, ignoring the warnings the knights gave that they would never come out again, only to meet the mountain clans, tend to their woods and then leave, unharmed and unfazed. I wonder if there are any clansmen called Bran, too. I think they call my father the Stark. Goldwing landed on his wrist, gripping tightly, but he knew when he was holding too tight or that he was starting to cut into his skin, so it always loosened up whenever he winced or when his arm started to hurt. Gods, he's as big as Rukon. He ran his other hand across the bird's soft feathers, the bird looking at him in utter silence, but he knew it was happy. There was a caw from besides him, a common raven that had taken Goldwing's perch upon the roof, looking down on him with eyes as black as night. He turned and looked back at it as he raised his hand. He hated ravens and their loud caws, so unlike the proud majestic silence of a golden eagle, especially Goldwing, who seemed all the more noble for the fact he never made a sound. Goldwing already knew what he was thinking, already staring at the raven and loosening its grip upon his arm, not moving an inch. Not till Bran threw his arm towards the raven and let Goldwing take flight. I hate ravens. The Maesters should use bigger birds. There are so many eagles in the north now, some are going wild, and they eat ravens. He looked up at the sky as the gigantic raptor bolted after the tiny raven. The sun was high in the sky, but his belly growled at him, like Goldwing, it was time to get something to eat. Then, I get to practice with my lance. Asterisk 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 asterisk. End of part 6. Notes. Now, where to start? Wargs are not just common in the north. They are well known in northern society, so there are a lot of things that they can do, and it's never hard for one of them to find any work, either in the north or abroad, across the narrow sea, where they can definitely find employment. Some lords in the south might have a few, too, but they are going to be much rarer than in the north or across the narrow sea. And of course, what could be better than a warg inside a war elephant? Speaking of animals, golden eagles like Goldwing are huge birds. They really can get to 7 feet of wingspan, and we know that there are eagles in Westeros. Hell, Orell had one in Cannon, and he's north of the wall. They like cold environments, like Canada, Scandinavia and Russia, so there's definitely no reason why they can't live in the north, too. Naturally, the sheer strength of such a large bird of prey means that it is perfect for wargs, since there are no other animals in the sky that would hunt one, except maybe dragons. They've even got the strength to deal with lone targets on their own, since it's well known that a lone golden eagle will attack wolves and hunt deer, too. They are the backbone of the Snowcloak's power, since not only can they see pretty much every crime as they are happening, they can rapidly respond to threats quick and efficiently. So if you're getting mugged in Winterfell, you really don't have to do anything to protect yourself, since a golden eagle could simply dive out of the sky and attack the mugger for you. Or several eagles, for that matter. So, simply put, Winterfell has a very, very low crime rate. They have other uses, too, especially when it comes to wartime. They can be used as aerial scouts, or to carry messages between separate armies, something that a raven cannot be trained to do. They are closer to UAVs than to animals, now, doubly so if you consider how extremely good the eyesight of a bird is. Like with the direwolves in canon, an animal that is often walked will develop a very strong bond with the person doing the watching, taking on trays. We see this in canon with how the personality of the direwolves develop, so a private animal, like Goldwing, will take on a lot of trays from their master, and in this case, Goldwing is, sort of chivalrous, if you can apply such a concept to a bird. However, the reverse is also true, which is why Donal has to wait with an hourglass. If one stays in the skin of an animal too long, they'll start to become less and less human, till all that remains is a beast in human clothes. And if you're wondering why Bran is worried about playing games inside the bird, just remember, he hasn't had the talk yet. In canon, he thought Jaime and Cersei were wrestling at first, and even here, where Catelyn tried even harder to shape Bran, he definitely doesn't know what they're on about. Oh, and we hear a little more about the Green Men. They are not planting new woods, at least, not outside the north, which is where they are most common, but they are tending to the ones in the south and ensuring that they are healthy and strong. The mountain clans have met them and the Green Men are actually welcomed by them, with the clansmen even knowing about the North and Winterfell, and about Ned, who they call the Stark, or the Ned like the northern clans might. If you can find a wood somewhere, the Green Men have either visited that area or are going to. And they have a plan. Anyway, Bran still dreams of being a member of the Kingsguard, and that's one of the main reasons he is practicing so hard at being a warg. He's hoping the ability might help him get in, so not only does he fly inside the bird, he goes hunting with it, though in those cases he usually spends his time outside the bird, not in it. If there's anything I've left out of the summary and you have questions, just say. Chapter 7, Theon I. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Asterisk 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 asterisk. I would rather be a bastard son of Winterfell than the true-born heir to the Iron Islands. The words echoed through his mind like ripples on a lake. The bastard had said them years ago, but they felt as fresh as the first time he had heard them, not long after he came to Winterfell. He had still been little more than a boy when his father rebelled, when his brothers went off to war to win glory, to plunder the coasts of the Seven Kingdoms and to conquer distant shores, as all the Ironborn of old had. But what had they really won but an early grave? His father had thought the break between the wolf and the stag had been permanent, that the North might have even been willing to do what he had done and crown Eddard Stark the king in the North. It had been a grave mistake, and one that had cost the Iron Islands dearly. The Lannister fleet had been moored in their port when his uncle burned them at harbour, man and ship alike being devoured by the hungry flames as they leapt from galley to galley. But the Darkstarks, when it became clear that the North was not going to break from the south, it had been his other uncle, Aeron, who had gone there with a fleet to attack them whilst they were vulnerable, only to find them already at sea and arrayed for war in a crescent. They had known that his uncle was coming, probably because of a wandering seagull or some such creature that one of Lord Darkstark's wargs had been inside, and met his fleet head-on, with the Mormonts on their flanks and the Golden Wolf in the center, the Darkstark flagship, a galley of mixed northern and westerlands heritage, with 2.5 decks and 200 oars, scorpions bristling from bow to sterns, and as a figurehead there was a wolf of gold, with eyes of topaz that had room for a torch behind them, which made them glow a fiery orange. It must have looked like a beast from the depths of hell when it sailed into the heart of battle, and it had been Lord Byrne who had led the boarding of his uncle's own command, the Golden Storm, a simple longship in comparison, and it had been that fight that cost his uncle an eye and an arm before he was tossed into the waves to die. He washed up near Lannisport a week later, a changed man, spiritual and devoted to the drowned god, a prisoner held within the rock till the end of the war. Just like the Starks hold me, I'm a prisoner here. He swilled his wine as he heard the bastard again, his quick-witted response that had made all the other boys laugh so long ago, the line that had turned them all against him before he ever had a chance to know them. I would rather be a bastard son of Winterfell than the true-born heir to the Iron Islands. It sent chills through his spine just to think about it, souring his poor mood even further, so he downed the cup in one go. The North had cities, like Winterfell and White Harbor, stretches of land so big as to be utterly unimaginable, forests filled with game, beautiful women and wealth too, even if the Northmen were humble in that they didn't like to show the riches that filled their coffers. And what will I have? Robb will have all this. All these cities to rule, gold to spend on whatever he wants, beautiful women to fuck whenever he wants. I've got an island. An island that the drowned god has been eating. We lost everything we had left in the rebellion, now we have nothing, not even our pride. The Iron Islands had no cities, no great plains of grassland, no ancient forests or woods and little wealth to speak of.